There is a strange fact hidden at the very beginning of history, and almost no one stops to wonder at it. The first cities on Earth, the first writing, the first written laws, the first empires, the whole slow machinery of what we call civilization, did not begin in a place of ease and plenty. They began in one of the most unforgiving landscapes a human being could possibly choose. A flat, hot, treeless plain with almost no stone to build from, no metal buried in its ground, no forests to cut for timber, and two great rivers that were as likely to drown a whole season's labour in an afternoon as they were to water it. By every obvious measure, it was the wrong place to start. And yet, it started here. Not up in the green foothills where wild wheat grew thick and gathering was easy, but down on the bare mud of the southern plain, where survival had to be won again and again, argued out season by season between the people and the water. That is the first mystery of this land, and it is worth holding on to as we begin. Why here? Why did the human story take its greatest leap in the hard place, and not the easy one? Before we follow that question down the long corridor of the centuries, and it will carry us from the very first seed ever planted on purpose to the burning of the greatest library the ancient world ever built, let me ask one small thing of you. If these slow journeys into the deep past are truly yours, the kind of night you look forward to, leave a quiet like before you settle in. It does more good than you would think. Follow along with the channel, so that when the next lost world rises out of the dark, it finds its way to you. And if you have a moment, leave a single word below and tell us where in the world you are listening from tonight. The name of your city and the hour showing on your clock as you read it. There is something steadying on nights like this in seeing how far apart we all are, scattered across the turning earth, and how the same ancient story still reaches every one of us. Now, back to the plain and the water and the question of why anyone stayed. Begin with the two rivers, because everything here begins with them. They are born far to the north, high in the cold folds of the mountains of eastern Anatolia, in what is now Turkey, fed by melting snow and mountain rain, gathering themselves out of 100 small streams. The Tigris runs fast and straight and dangerous. The Euphrates runs slower, wider, gentler, wandering as it goes. And as they come down out of the highlands and onto the lowlands, they do a quiet and astonishing thing. They carry the mountains with them. Every flood tears a little more stone and soil from the highlands and grinds it to powder in the current, and every year the rivers spread that powder, fine, soft, grey-brown silt, across the flat land in a thin new skin. Do this for 100,000 years, for 1,000,000, and you build a country out of nothing but suspended mud. The ground beneath the whole southern plain was once the flank of a mountain 1,000 kilometres away. The rivers took it apart particle by particle and carried it south and set it down and made the flattest, richest, strangest land in the ancient world. A land with no bones of its own, no bedrock near the surface, only depth upon depth of river-laid earth. This is the land the Greeks, thousands of years later, would look back on and name Mesopotamia, from their own words for middle and river, the land in the middle of the rivers, the land between. But that is a visitor's word, a latecomer's word. To the people who first walked out onto that plain and decided against all their instincts to stay, it had no such tidy name. It was simply the place where the water was, and the mud was soft, and the reeds grew tall, and a person might be able to live. To understand why they came at all, you have to go back further still, past the first villages, to a change in the sky. For more than 2 million years, the human story had been a story of cold. Ice ages came and went in long, grinding cycles, and through nearly all of it our ancestors lived as they had always lived, moving, following the herds, reading the seasons, gathering what ripened and leaving when it was gone. A home was a thing of hides and branches, put up in an afternoon and abandoned without a backward glance when the land had given all it had. Safety was in the legs. To stay too long in one place was to starve, and so for uncountable generations no one stayed. Then, roughly 12,000 years ago, the last great cold loosened its grip. The ice sheets that had lain across the north began to melt and retreat. The seas rose, rains shifted, and across the arc of hills and valleys that curves through the Near East, the belt of good land that scholars call the Fertile Crescent, a new and generous world came into being almost overnight, as such things go. Wild wheat and wild barley grew across whole hillsides, thick as a planted field. Groves of wild pistachio dropped their nuts. Gazelle moved in herds too large to count. For people who had known scarcity as the permanent condition of life, it must have looked like a vision, like the world tilting toward mercy. And here is where the first cracks appear in the oldest human habit. When the food will not run out, when the same slope gives grain this year and next year and the year after, the ancient logic of movement begins to fail. Why walk away from abundance? Why not stay one more season and then another? Slowly, in scattered places, small bands of hunter-gatherers began to linger. They came back to the same good spots year after year. They built sturdier shelters, because a shelter you will return to is worth building well. And without any single person ever deciding it, without anyone knowing what they were beginning, the human race started in a few places to hold still. We can stand at some of those places even now, in the layers the archaeologists have peeled back. At a site called Abu Huraira on the Euphrates, people lived in round huts of mud and reed around 11,000 years ago, grinding wild grain on heavy stones worn smooth from use, returning to the same ground across the generations. At Jericho, in the valley of the Jordan, something even stranger appears. There, some 11,000 years ago, people did not merely settle. They built a wall of stone massive for its age, ringing the town. And inside the wall they raised a tower nearly 9 meters tall, with a staircase spiralling up through its heart. Think about what a wall and a tower mean at the very dawn of settled life. They mean labour spent not on food, but on permanence. They mean a group of people looking at a patch of ground and deciding, together, this is ours, and we will not be moved. No one is entirely sure what the tower was for. A watchpost, a shrine, a marker aligned to the midsummer sun. But its meaning is not really in dispute. Somebody, at the beginning of everything, wanted to build upward, wanted to make a thing that would stand and be seen and say we are here. That impulse, to raise something taller than a life, something that outlasts the hand that made it, will run through this entire story like a thread of gold, from the tower at Jericho to the great stepped temples of the plain, all the way down to a library in Baghdad. Farther north, in the highlands of Anatolia, there was a place stranger still. It is called Çatalhöyük, and it was less a village than a dense, humming honeycomb of houses, home perhaps to several thousand people. But it had no streets. None. The houses were pressed against one another with no gaps between, and people entered their homes not through doors in the walls but through holes in the roofs, climbing down a ladder into the dim interior. The whole settlement was a single connected surface of rooftops, and daily life moved across the top of the town rather than through it. Inside those houses the people painted their walls, bulls with enormous horns, hunting scenes, patterns whose meaning we can only guess at. And beneath the floors, under the very platforms where the living slept and cooked and ate, they buried their dead. The ancestors lay directly below the feet of the family, curled as if sleeping. To live at Çatalhöyük was to sleep every night above the bones of your own grandmothers, the dead woven quietly into the fabric of the house, present and near and not sent away. It is one of the most intimate and haunting arrangements in the whole record of the human past, and it tells us something about what settling down did to the mind. When you no longer move, the dead no longer get left behind. They stay. They become part of the address. But here is the part of the story that the textbooks so often hurry past, and it is the strangest part of all. Settling down did not make people healthier. It made them worse. The bones tell it plainly. Compared with their roaming ancestors, the first farmers were shorter. Their teeth were worse, ground down and rotted by a heavy diet of starchy grain. New diseases moved through their crowded settlements, and living pressed up against their own animals gave those diseases new ways to reach them. Their bodies bent under repetitive labour, the endless grinding of grain, the hauling of water, in ways the bones still record thousands of years later. By almost every measure of an individual life, the move to farming was a step down. The wanderers had eaten a more varied diet and worked, in many seasons, less hard, and yet they never went back. That is the paradox that sits like a locked door at the entrance to civilization, and it is worth pausing on before we walk through. Farming was harder and, for the single human body, often worse, and still it won, everywhere, without exception, and never once reversed. Why? The answer is quiet and a little unsettling. Farming did not win because it was better for the person. It won because it made more people. A field feeds more mouths per acre than a wilderness does. Stored grain carried a family through a bad season that would have killed a band of foragers. More children survived. Populations swelled. And a large settled population, once it exists, cannot simply choose to scatter back into the hills. There is no longer enough wild food out there to hold them all. The door had shut behind them. They had traded freedom and health for numbers and permanence, and numbers and permanence, once you have them, keep you. The village could not become a wandering band again any more than a river can climb back up the mountain. So they stayed, on the hard plain above their ancestors, tied now to the seed and the flood and the slow turning of the agricultural year. And out of that trap, for it was a kind of trap, everything else we were about to follow was going to grow. The rivers, indifferent, went on carrying the mountains south, grain by grain, laying down the ground on which the first cities would one day stand. If the decision to stay was the first great leap, the second was quieter and slower, and in the end more powerful. It was the moment a human being first looked at a wild plant and understood that it could be commanded. For thousands of years people had gathered wild grain where it grew, but somewhere along the way, not in a single flash of genius, but across countless small unremembered acts, they began to notice things. That some stalks stood taller and held against the wind. That some heads of grain kept their seeds instead of shattering and scattering them uselessly to the ground the moment they were ripe. That some ripened together, predictably, on the same days. And the ones that held their seed were, of course, the ones easiest to harvest whole. So those were the ones gathered and carried home, and when the spare seed was thrown down near the settlement, the ones that grew again the following year. Do that without meaning to for a few dozen generations, and you change the plant itself. You breed a wheat that cannot even sow itself anymore, whose seeds cling to the stalk and wait for a human hand. By around 10,000 years ago, the wild grasses of the hills had become domesticated crops, dependent on people to plant them, to harvest them, to carry their seed forward. And people had become, without a treaty ever being signed, the servants and the masters of the grain, bound to it as tightly as it was bound to them. With that came an entirely new relationship to time. The hunter lives in the near future, the next herd, the next grove, this week, this moon. The farmer has to live months ahead. To plant is to imagine an autumn you cannot yet see, and to gamble the winter on it. So in the spring, tend through the burning summer, reap in the autumn, and store, carefully, jealously, against the cold months when nothing grows. The seasons stopped being a signal to move and became a wheel that turned in place, and human life turned with it. People who could not think months ahead did not eat. Slowly, patiently, the plain was teaching its people to plan. The animals came under the same slow spell. Sheep and goats, hardy and social, edged closer to the settlements and were kept, and over generations grew smaller and calmer and more useful, giving their wool and their milk without the danger of the hunt. Pigs, drawn by the scraps and the waste of human living, made themselves at home, and even the aurochs, the great, long-horned, genuinely dangerous wild cattle of the plains, beasts that could kill a man, were incredibly brought to heel, their tamed descendants becoming the first herds of cattle. It is easy to say the word domestication and pass on, but stop and feel the strangeness of it. Creatures that had been prey or peril for the whole of human history now stood penned beside the house, calm, counted, owned. For the first time, meat and milk and hide and wool were not things you chased and hoped for. They were resources you could measure and plan and keep. And here abundance did a curious thing. It created a problem no one had ever had before. Surplus. A wild band eats what it finds. A farming family in a good year grows more than it can eat. And more than you can eat has to go somewhere. It has to be stored. Against the lean months, against a bad flood, against the raiders who will certainly come once word spreads that there is grain worth taking. So people dug pits and sealed them. They wove baskets and smeared them with river tar to keep out the damp. And in time they discovered the technology that, more than almost any other, made settled life possible. Fired clay. It is hard, surrounded as we are by plastic and steel, to feel how enormous pottery was. But think about what a sealed clay jar does. It keeps grain dry and safe from mice and rot for months, even years. It carries water and oil across distances. It lets a household cook in new ways and store against disaster, and put something by for a child not yet born. The plain had almost no stone and no metal, but it had endless soft mud. And mud, shaped and baked hard, became jars and bowls and the whole quiet infrastructure of keeping. The humblest pot in the corner of a house was in its way a small fortress. It held the future. But the plain still had one enemy that no jar could defeat, and it was the very thing that had made the plain possible in the first place. The rivers. The Tigris and the Euphrates were generous and treacherous in equal measure. They flooded, but at the wrong time in the late spring, after the grain was already in the ground and before it was ready to harvest, so that a bad flood could tear away a whole year of work in a night. And in other years they failed, running low, leaving the fields to crack and the crops to wither. To farm the southern plains seriously, to make it yield the great surpluses it was capable of, a family could not simply plant and pray. They had to take hold of the water itself, and so they began to dig. Canals to carry the flood out to fields the river never reached on its own. Dikes and banks to hold the water back when it came too hard. Basins to store it against the dry months. They reshaped the land with their hands, cutting channels through the mud, turning a strip of riverbank into a spreading country of green. Irrigation was not a small improvement. It was a revolution as deep as farming itself, because it multiplied the land. It let people grow crops far beyond the narrow reach of the natural flood, and that meant more food, and more food meant more people, and more people meant everything that was coming. But, and this is the hinge on which the entire history of the plain turns, no single family could do it. A canal is not a private thing. It runs for miles. It has to be dug by many hands, and then it has to be maintained forever, cleared of the silt that chokes it every single year. its banks watched and mended, its water shared out. For the water one family takes is water another family does not get. Who digs? Who clears? Who decides whose field is watered first when the river runs low and there is not enough for all? These are not questions a household can answer alone. They are questions that require the whole community to agree, to cooperate, to organise, and, when cooperation fails, to be made to cooperate. Look closely and you can see it. In the mud of those first canals, humanity was digging more than water channels. It was digging the first foundations of government. The need to move water fairly across many fields is one of the oldest reasons in the world for people to submit to a shared authority, to accept that someone must keep the accounts, settle the disputes, call up the labour, and enforce the rules. Learning to manage the river, the people of the plain were, without quite realising it, learning to manage one another. The canal came first. The state grew out of it like a reed out of the wet ground. And with all of this, the surplus, the stored grain, the owned herds, came the shadow that has never since left human society: inequality. When there is more than enough, some come to have more than others. The family with the larger field, the fuller storehouse, the bigger herd, has something its neighbours do not, and can lend it, and be owed for it, and grow stronger. The rough equality of the wandering band, where no one could carry much and so no one had much, was gone. In its place came households of greater and lesser wealth, and debts and dependence, and the first faint outlines of the powerful and the poor. The same fields that fed everyone also, quietly, began to divide them. By around 7,000 years ago, down in the deep south of the plain, where the rivers unravelled into marsh and reed before reaching the warm Gulf, the first small settlements of this new world were taking shape. Places with names that would one day be spoken with awe: Eridu, Uruk, began as clusters of mud brick houses along the water channels, modest and fragile, their people farming and fishing and shaping clay. There was nothing yet to mark them as the seedbeds of the first cities on earth. There was only the plain and the water and a growing number of people who had learned, over many patient centuries, how to bend the earth to feed them. The stage was set. The players were gathering, and out on the flat land under the enormous sky, the first true city was about to be born. There is a place where the village becomes something the world had never seen before, and we can name it. It is Uruk, on the southern plain, and around 5,500 years ago, it did something no cluster of human beings had ever done. It grew past every limit. For the whole of the human story until then, people had lived in groups the mind could hold. Bands of dozens, villages of a few hundred, at most a crowded town of a few thousand where nearly everyone knew nearly everyone. Uruk broke that. At its height it may have held 50,000 people or more, packed into a sprawl of houses and workshops and temples and open squares covering an area you could not walk across in an afternoon. 50,000, a number of strangers. For the first time in history, a person could walk through the place they lived and pass faces they had never seen and would never see again. And this simple, strange fact changed everything about how humans had to live together. Because a village runs on knowing. You behave in a village, partly because everyone knows you and knows your family and will remember. But a city of 50,000 strangers cannot run on knowing. It needs something else to hold it together. Shared rules, shared authority, shared belief, and above all, ways of keeping track. Who owns this field? Who owes that grain? Who paid and who has not? In the village, these things lived in memory and in trust. In the city, memory was not enough. The city needed to remember on its behalf, and out of that need, not out of poetry, not out of any wish to make literature, but out of the sheer accounting pressure of a city too large to hold in any single head, came the invention that may be the most consequential in the whole human record: writing. It did not arrive as an idea. It crept in through the storehouse. At first there were tokens, small shaped pieces of clay, each standing for a thing. This shape for a measure of grain, that one for a sheep, another for a jar of oil. Count out the tokens and you have counted the goods. To send a shipment, you sealed the matching tokens inside a hollow ball of clay so that no one could add or remove any along the way. But a sealed ball is a nuisance. You have to break it to see what is inside. So someone cleverly began pressing the tokens into the soft outside of the ball before sealing it, leaving their shape stamped on the surface as a label. And then someone cleverer still realized the sealed tokens inside had become pointless. The marks on the outside said everything. You could throw away the tokens and keep only the marks. You could press the marks straight into a flat tablet of wet clay. And in that small, almost accidental step, from thing to token to the mark of a token to a mark that stood on its own, human beings learned to take a thought out of a mind and set it down in the world, where it would wait, unchanging, to be read again by someone else, in another place, in another year, long after the moment and the voice that made it were gone. The scribes of Uruk worked in wet clay with a cut reed, pressing its tip into the surface. The reed left a small wedge-shaped stroke, and by combining these wedges in patterns they built up their signs. And so the script is called cuneiform, from the Latin for wedge. At first the signs were little pictures, a picture of a jar for oil, a stylized head for a person, a star for the sky and for the gods. But pictures are slow and limited, and over the centuries the signs moved away from what they showed. They became abstract, faster to draw, and, this was the crucial turn, they began to stand not for things but for sounds. Once a sign can carry a sound, writing is no longer a list of goods. It can carry a name, a sentence, a prayer, a law, a story. It can carry anything a person can say. The receipt had quietly become a language. Consider what that did to power. In a world where almost no one could read, the handful who could held a kind of quiet magic. A scribe could fix a debt so that it could not be denied, could mark a boundary that would still be there when the men who agreed it were dead, could write down a king's command and send it, exact and unaltered, to a city the king would never visit. Reading and writing were rare, difficult, and tied tightly to the temple, and, later, the palace, and so knowledge itself became a form of authority, concentrated in the hands of the few who had spent years in the tablet houses learning the 600 signs. The scribe, bent over his clay in a corner of the storehouse, is one of the true founders of the world we still live in. Every contract, every scripture, every book, every word glowing on a screen tonight, all of it descends from that reed pressed into wet mud in Uruk, to remember what a city was too large to hold in its head. But Uruk was not only tablets and accounts. It was a place alive with the first true division of human labour. Because the fields fed more than the farmers, some hands could be freed from food entirely. Potters spun their vessels on the fast wheel, turning out in hours what had once taken days. Smiths beat copper into tools harder and sharper than any stone. Weavers filled great workshops, many of them women, producing woolen cloth by the ton, the plain's most valuable export. Jewellers set deep blue lapis lazuli, carried all the way from the mountains of Afghanistan into ornaments that caught the light. Carvers cut tiny scenes into stone cylinders that, rolled across wet clay, left a signature no one else could copy. Each of these was a life given over to a single craft, possible only because other lives were given over to growing the grain that fed them all. The city was a machine for turning surplus into skill, and skill into things no village could ever have made. And over all of it, rising higher with every generation, stood the temple. In Uruk, the great temple platform lifted the house of the goddess above the flat plain so that its whitewashed walls could be seen for miles, a bright point of order and awe on the level horizon. To raise a building up onto an artificial mountain of brick was to say that the divine belonged above the ordinary world nearer the sky, and those platforms would grow over the centuries into the vast stepped towers we call ziggurats, the stairways to heaven that still haunt the imagination of the plain. This is the city that remembered dimly a king named Gilgamesh, a ruler of Uruk who may truly have lived, who built its walls, and around whose name there gathered, over long centuries, the greatest story the ancient world would tell. The story of a king who could not accept that he would die, and who went to the ends of the earth to escape death, and who failed, and who came home at last to the one thing that would outlast him, the walls of his own city. But that story is still ahead of us. For now it is enough to stand in Uruk and understand what has happened. A place has come into being that is greater than any family, greater than any single life, held together not by blood but by writing and worship and shared work. A thing with a life of its own, fed by the fields, watered by the canals, remembering itself in clay. The city has been invented, and nothing about the human story will ever be the same. Out on the plain the other cities were rising too. Eridu, oldest of them all, where later people said the very first kingship had come down from heaven. Near the Gulf, a dozen more, each with its own god, its own walls, its own proud sense of being the centre of the world. They traded, they quarrelled, they fought over water and land and honour. And in that crowded, brilliant, quarrelling landscape of rival cities, a new and terrible question was rising that no village had ever had to answer. When you have walls worth defending and grain worth stealing and strangers by the thousand who must be commanded, who rules? Before there were kings on the plain, there were priests. And before there were priests, there was fear. Try to feel the world as the people of the early cities felt it. The river swelled one year and drowned the fields. The next year it failed and the ground cracked. A storm came out of a clear sky and flattened the barley. A sickness moved through the streets and took the children. None of it could be predicted, and none of it could be controlled, and all of it meant the difference between a full storehouse and a season of hunger. When your survival hangs on forces that huge and that blind, the mind reaches for a way to bargain with them. Surely the flood has a reason. Surely the storm can be appeased. Surely, if the right things are said and the right gifts are given, the powers behind the sky can be persuaded to be kind. So at first the sacred was small. A shrine in the corner of a village, no bigger than a house. A little figure of clay or stone standing for a spirit of the grain, a guardian of the water. People brought what they had, a bowl of barley, a handful of dates, a lamb, and laid it down and hoped. The shrine was a place where the unbearable uncertainty of life could be given a shape, where fear could be turned into ritual, and ritual is a way of doing something when there is nothing to be done. But as the villages swelled into cities, the shrines swelled with them, and something remarkable happened along the way. The temple stopped being only a house of worship. It became the beating institutional heart of the city, its bank, its granary, its workshop, its courthouse, and its centre of learning all at once. Watch how it happens. The god's house needs to be supplied, so grain flows in, offerings, tithes, the produce of fields worked in the god's name. That grain has to be counted, stored, guarded, and given back out in the lean seasons. To count it, you need records, and so the temple becomes a house of writing. To store it, you need buildings and guards, and so the temple becomes a fortress of surplus. To give it back fairly in a famine, you need someone with the authority to decide, and so the temple becomes a seat of power. Whoever controls the god storehouse controls, in a real and material sense, the survival of the city, And that control, wrapped in the robes of the sacred, was the first great concentration of power the world had known that did not rest simply on being the head of a family. Authority had found a new place to grow, not in blood, in ritual. And the priests who tended these places were not at first a separate class, perhaps only the elders wisest in the old rites, most trusted to know what the gods wanted. But over generations they became specialists, men and women who gave their whole lives to the mysteries of the divine. Their task was not only to perform the rites, but to interpret them, to answer the questions the whole city was desperate to have answered. Was the flood a blessing or a punishment? Do the stars promise a good harvest or a hard one? Is this sickness a warning? And if so, of what? In their answers lay comfort and order and, inevitably, power. The one who can tell the city what the gods intend stands very close to the one who tells the city what to do. To understand how completely the god was felt to be present, look at what the priests actually did, day by day, inside the temple. The god was not a distant abstraction living far away in the sky. The god was here, in the statue, in this room, among the people, and so the god was cared for exactly as a great living king might be. At dawn the priests washed the statue and dressed it in fine cloth. Meals were set before it 3 times a day, bread, beer, meat, sweet things, and taken away, and the god was understood to have consumed the essence of them. Musicians played, singers chanted hymns, incense burned. The divine was treated as tangible and immediate, and in a way that can startle us needy, hungry, thirsty, requiring service, capable of being pleased or offended by the quality of the meal. To neglect the god was not merely impious. It was dangerous because a neglected god might turn his back on the city in its hour of need, and then the flood would come at the wrong time, and the enemy at the gate, and everyone would know whose fault it was. At Eridu, the oldest of the cities, the archaeologists dug down through the layers and found the whole story stacked in the earth. Temple built upon temple built upon temple, each generation raising a new and grander house of the god directly on the ruins of the last, reaching back to a humble shrine at the very bottom, and climbing, over the centuries, toward a great complex of courtyards and altars. The people were not merely rebuilding, they were affirming again and again across 1,000 years that this spot was sacred, that here the connection between the earth and the powers above was fixed and permanent. The ground itself became holy through sheer persistence of belief, and out of all this, out of the counting of the gods' grain and the recording of the gods' herds and the tallying of who had given what, came, as we have seen, the pressure that produced writing itself. It is one of the quiet ironies at the root of civilization that the very first things human beings ever wrote were not hymns or laws or love poems. They were inventories, lists of sheep, records of rations handed out to temple workers, tallies of jars of oil. The great gift of the written word, the power to make a thought outlast the mind that had it, was born in a storehouse from the need to keep the accounts of a god who had to be fed. The temple shaped the whole texture of life around it. Its lands were worked by farmers who owed it rent and labour. Its workshops employed weavers and potters and smiths by the hundred. Its herds were tended by shepherds in the god's name. Its goods were carried to distant cities by merchants under its seal. To serve the temple was to serve the city, and the two were nearly impossible to tell apart. The god's estate was, in a real sense, the largest enterprise in the world. But the temple, for all its power, was never entirely secure, and its very insecurity drove it to greater and greater spectacle. A flood could sweep it away, a fire could take its wooden beams, a rival city could carry off its treasures, and worse, its god. For to steal the statue of a city's god was to steal its soul. And the priests, for all their authority, depended utterly on one fragile thing: the continued belief of the people that the god truly dwelt within the walls. So the temple had to keep proving it. Festivals grew grander. On the great days, the statue of the god was carried out through the streets, clothed in gold, borne on a litter, surrounded by music and dancing, so that the whole city could see with its own eyes that the divine was present and cared for and glorious. The city became a stage, and the god its central figure, and everyone watching was reminded in colour and sound and procession that their prosperity flowed down from above. This is the world into which the king was about to walk, a world already organised around the idea that power came from the heavens and that some people stood closer to the gods than others. A world with storehouses worth controlling, labour worth commanding, and a deep, trained readiness to obey whoever could convince the city that the gods had chosen him. The temple had built the throne. It only remained for someone to climb onto it, and it would be war more than anything else that lifted him there. Power on the plain did not begin with a crown. It began with a problem no one could solve alone. A city of tens of thousands cannot run on the goodwill of neighbours. Its canals need thousands of hands to keep them open. Its fields must be measured and its harvests taxed and its disputes judged and its walls manned. And when the enemy gathers on the horizon, when another city, hungry for the same water and the same land, comes with spears, someone has to decide quickly and be obeyed. In the ordinary business of the city, councils of elders could deliberate and assemblies of free men could argue. But in the emergency, deliberation is death. The flood does not wait for a vote. The army at the gate does not pause while the assembly debates. And so, again and again, the cities reached for the same answer: give one person the authority to command for the duration of the crisis. The trouble with that answer is that the crisis never quite ends. There's always another flood coming, always another rival sharpening its spears. And the man given power for the emergency has every reason and every means to make sure the emergency never fully passes. So the temporary war leader hardened over generations into a permanent office. The office grew a throne, and the throne grew a story about itself, because raw force alone is a fragile thing to rule by. The kings of the plain did not present themselves as strong men who had seized power. They presented themselves as chosen, shepherds appointed by the gods to guard the flock, judges set over the land to enforce a divine justice, warriors selected by heaven to defend the sacred fields. Their crowns were not merely signs of rank, they were signs of favour, and in that fusion, the sword in one hand and the god's blessing in the other, the shape of monarchy was cast, and it would hold in one form or another for the next 5,000 years. War made the king, and the king made more war. As the cities grew, they pressed against one another, and the things they fought over were the things that meant life itself. The fertile strips of land, the shared canals, the water that one city could steal from another simply by cutting a channel upstream. Raiding, once the rough business of small bands, became organised campaigning. Soldiers in disciplined ranks, spears and shields and axes, and behind them the first war carts drawn by donkeys, thundering across the flat plain. Walls rose higher, and gates grew stronger, and the earliest kings were, almost without exception, war leaders first, men whose right to rule was proved on the battlefield, whose victories were read as the favour of the gods, and whose defeats were read as the gods turning away. To feel how total the king's power could become, how far it reached in the minds of the people beyond the ordinary limits of a life, you have only to go down into the earth at into the great royal cemetery, and stand at the edge of what the archaeologists found there and called, with an honesty that still chills, the death pit. It is one of the most extraordinary and disturbing discoveries in the whole record of the ancient world. In the graves of Ur's earliest kings and queens, some 4,500 years ago, the ruler did not go into the ground alone. down into the great pit, arranged with terrible care, went the court itself. Soldiers with their weapons, stationed as if on guard. Grooms with the oxen and the wagons, and women, dozens of them in some of the graves, attendants and musicians dressed in their finest, in headdresses of gold and lapis and carnelian. One of them found still with her hands near the strings of the lyre she'd carried down. They lay in ordered rows, and they had gone down alive, and they had died there, quietly, in the dark, to accompany their ruler into whatever came next. Stop for a moment at the human weight of that. Dozens of people dressed as if for a feast, walking down into a pit in the earth, in the full knowledge that they would not walk out, and lying down in their places and taking whatever they took, and dying so that a king would not have to enter the underworld unattended. We do not know exactly what they believed, or what was promised them, or whether the promise brought them any comfort at the end. But we know they went, and what it tells us is how far the idea of the king had already travelled, that his authority did not stop at the edge of his own life, but reached over the border of death itself and pulled a whole court after him into the dark. This was kingship carved not in stone but in flesh, a claim of power so total that other human beings would lie down and die to serve it. The kings left their claims in stone as well, everywhere they could. On carved slabs and monuments they had themselves shown towering over their enemies, weapons raised, captives bound and kneeling at their feet. The fields of the dead trampled beneath their wheels. These were not records. They were propaganda, the oldest propaganda in the world, declarations cut into rock so they would last, that the king was the wall against chaos, the guardian of order, the one man standing between the city and the flood, the enemy, the dark. To look on such an image was to be told wordlessly that to resist this man was to resist heaven itself, and war fed on itself, as it always has. A victorious king took tribute, grain, herds, labour, human beings, from the cities he beat, and that wealth flowed into his palace and his temple, and it paid for more soldiers, and more soldiers conquered more cities, which paid more tribute, round and round. And somewhere in that spiral a new and enormous idea was born, an idea that would obsess rulers for the rest of history, that one city might not merely defeat its neighbours but rule them, might reach out and hold many cities under a single hand, a single crown, a single will, not just a city, an empire. For a long time it stayed a dream. The cities of the plain were too proud, too jealous, too devoted each to its own god to stay yoked together for long. One king would rise, humble his rivals, proclaim himself overlord, and within a generation the whole thing would come apart again, the cities springing back to their old independence like reeds bent and released. The southern plain in those centuries was a patchwork of proud rival cities, each claiming to be the true heart of the land, each hostage to its own quarrels, none able to hold the others down for more than a lifetime. It would take an outsider to break the pattern. A man from the north, of a different tongue, who had not been raised in the old rivalries, who looked at the whole quarrelling patchwork of cities and saw, for the first time, something that could be seized entire. His name, or the name history remembers, was Sargon, and the story of how he came to power begins, if the old tale is to be believed, with a baby, a basket, and a river. The story the Mesopotamians themselves told about the first emperor is so old and so strangely familiar that it stops you in your tracks. There was a woman, it was said, a priestess or a temple servant, someone who, for reasons the tale keeps to itself, could not keep the child she had borne. So she made a basket of reeds and sealed its seams with tar, the same river tar the plain used to waterproof its baskets and its boats, and she laid the infant inside, and she set the basket on the river, and let the water carry him away. He floated downstream until a man who drew water for the fields, a gardener, lifted him out and took him in and raised him as his own. And from that beginning, a foundling of no family, pulled from a river in a basket of reeds, the child rose to shake the world. If that story tugs at something in you, it should. Thousands of years later, another people would tell almost exactly the same tale about a baby set afloat on a river in a reed basket sealed with pitch, drawn out of the water and raised to lead a nation, the story of Moses. Which came first, and how one echoes the other, is a question that has kept scholars busy for a very long time. But the older telling by far is this one, on the Mesopotamian plain, the abandoned child, the river, the basket, the rise to greatness. It is one of the oldest shapes a human story can take, and here it is at the very root, attached to the name of the man who invented empire. His name was Sargon, or rather, that is the name he took. A throne name meaning something like, the king is legitimate, which is exactly the kind of name a man chooses when he knows perfectly well that he is not. Because whatever the truth behind the basket and the river, one thing is clear. Sargon was not born to rule. He rose through the household of the king of a northern city, close to power but not of the royal blood, a servant near the throne, and then, around 43 centuries ago, through some act of revolt or intrigue the records only hint at, he took the throne for himself. Others had done that before, seized a city and called themselves king and been forgotten. What made Sargon different was that he did not stop at one city. He looked south, to the ancient proud cities of the plain, locked as they always were in their endless mutual quarrels, and where everyone else had seen an unconquerable tangle of rivals, he saw a single prize. His armies, hardened and loyal, marched from city to city, and one by one the old independent cities fell before him. He's said to have kept 5,400 men who ate before him daily, a standing force, fed at the king's table, ready at all times. And when the south was beaten, he did the thing that had never been done. He did not let the conquered cities return to their old ways under their own rulers, as every previous overlord had. He tore out their independence by the root, put his own governors and his own family in charge, and made the tribute flow not to 100 local temples but to one place, his new capital, Akkad. We do not even know for certain where Akkad stood. Its ruins have never been found, somewhere out on the plain near where Baghdad rises today. But from that vanished city, Sargon ruled a realm that stretched, by his own boast, from the lower sea to the upper sea, from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. He claimed to have washed his weapons in both. For the first time in the history of the world, a single authority held not just a city, not just a region, but a vast sweep of lands and peoples speaking different tongues under one crown. The idea itself was revolutionary. The whole assumption of Mesopotamian life had been the independent city, each with its own god and its own king. Sargon replaced it with something the world had never imagined, the multitude of cities, bound and ruled as one. The map of human possibility had been redrawn, and the empire changed everything it touched. Trade, once broken and dangerous between hostile cities, flowed freely and far under a single protecting power. The caravans of Akkad reached for timber from the western mountains, copper from the far side of the Gulf, silver from Anatolia, the deep blue lapis of Afghanistan. The scribes stretched the old writing to fit the ruling people's own language, for these northerners spoke a Semitic tongue, which we call Akkadian, related to Hebrew and Arabic, unlike the Sumerian of the southern cities. And so the plain became, for the first time, a place of two languages. Sumerian, the old sacred tongue of the temples, kept alive for religion and learning, and Akkadian, the living language of power and the street. That double inheritance, a dead language of the sacred alongside a living language of daily life, would echo down the ages, the way Latin would one day survive in the churches of Europe long after no one spoke it in the market. But no empire is built without blood, and Sargon's was not. His armies put down rebellion after rebellion. Cities that resisted were broken. Populations were shifted to shatter their old loyalties. To the beaten cities of the south, the men of Akkad were conquerors, and their independence was gone, and their gods made to bow. And yet, this is the strange grace of the plain. The brilliance of the conquered did not die. It fused with the power of the conqueror, Sumerian genius married to Akkadian reach, and produced one of the richest cultural blooms of the ancient world. Sargon ruled for more than half a century, long enough to sink the roots of his new idea deep into the ground. And when he died, he left behind not merely conquered lands, but a possibility that would haunt every ambitious ruler forever after, that the world could be made one, that many peoples could be gathered under a single will. His grandson would take that possibility to its dizzying, dangerous height. That grandson was Naram-Sin, and under him the empire reached its peak and its hubris. His armies pushed the borders further still into the mountains and beyond. His image loomed on his monuments larger than the men around him, and on his most famous carving, the great victory stele, he is shown climbing a mountain over the bodies of his broken enemies, and above his head, where the symbols of the gods would ordinarily float, there is his own horned helmet, the horns that in that world marked a god. For Naram-Sin had done the unthinkable. He had declared himself divine, not the chosen of the gods, a god, to be worshipped in his own lifetime alongside them. And then it fell apart. Whether through the arrogance the later poets blamed, they told a story in which Naram-Sin desecrated the great temple at Nippur and brought a curse down on Akkad, so that the god sent a savage mountain people pouring in to punish the whole land, or through the drought that the earth itself seems to record in those years, or through the simple overreach of an empire stretched too thin, the great experiment of Akkad came undone. The mountain tribes swept in, the cities rebelled, the canals fell into ruin, famine walked the land, and Akkad, the first imperial capital in the history of the world, vanished so completely that we cannot find so much as its foundations. The first empire ended not with a monument but with an absence, a name, a memory, a lesson, and no city at all. But the idea could not be uninvented. Later kings, from Babylon and from Assyria, would trace their legitimacy back to Sargon 2,000 years after his death, the way a family keeps the portrait of a founding ancestor on the wall. The experiment had failed. The dream survived. And before we follow it forward, we must stop and meet one more person from Sargon's world. Because among the people the first emperor set in place across his empire was his own daughter, and she did something no one, in all the tens of thousands of years of human speech before her, had ever done. She put her name to her words. Think of all the words that were spoken before this moment. Tens of thousands of years of human speech, stories told around fires, prayers whispered over the sick, songs sung to children, the whole vast ocean of everything our ancestors ever said, and not one voice among them that we can name. The words came and went on the air and were gone, and the people who spoke them are anonymous forever, a great silent crowd stretching back to the beginning. And then, on the Mesopotamian plain, around 43 centuries ago, that silence breaks. For the first time in the history of the world, a piece of writing comes down to us with a person attached to it, a real, named individual who says, in effect, I made this, I am the one who wrote these words, remember me. And the astonishing thing, the thing that ought to be far more famous than it is that the first author whose name we know, the first named author in all of human history, was not a king or a priest or a general. She was a woman. Her name was Enheduanna. She was a daughter of Sargon, the emperor of the basket and the river, and he had done something shrewd with her. When he conquered the ancient southern city of he needed a way to bind its proud, unruly people to his rule, and religion was the strongest binding there was. So he made his daughter the high priestess of the moon god at the most important religious office in the south, and placed her at the very heart of the conquered land's sacred life. It was a political appointment, a way of stitching the old religion of the south to the new power of the north through the body of a single royal woman. But Enheduanna became far more than a political instrument. She became a poet, and her poems were so powerful that they were copied and recopied and studied in the scribal schools for 500 years after her death. She wrote hymns to the temples of the land, a whole cycle of them, one for each of the great sanctuaries, and she wrote, above all, to the goddess, to Inanna, the fierce and complicated goddess of love and war, of desire and destruction, the most vivid and dangerous figure in the whole crowded heaven of the plain. And in one of her greatest poems, Enheduanna does something that no anonymous hymn had ever done. She writes herself into it. She tells us her own story, because Enheduanna's life did not stay serene. At some point a rebellion swept the south. A usurper rose, and Enheduanna was driven out of her temple, stripped of her office, sent into exile, her whole sacred world torn away from her. And instead of vanishing into the silence like everyone before her, she took up her reed and wrote about it. She cried out to the goddess in her own voice, naming her own suffering. I, who once sat in the temple, she says in effect, have been cast out, made to wander, forced to live where the light is bad. The man who did this has defiled the sacred places. Goddess, my goddess, see what has been done to me and restore me, and let the world know your power through my deliverance. It is a prayer, and it is a plea, and it is also unmistakably the cry of a specific human being at a specific moment in real pain, reaching for help, and signing her name to it so that it would last. And it lasted. It lasted more than 4,000 years. We are reading it now. Sit for a moment with the strangeness and the wonder of that. A woman on the mud plain 43 centuries ago wrote down her own name and her own grief and her own faith, and pressed them into clay, and that clay, copied by student after student in the schools, carried forward hand to hand across the fall of empires, outlasted her by 4,000 years and reached across all of that ruin and darkness to us tonight. The hand that shaped those wedges is dust so old the word dust barely means anything anymore. And still the marks speak. Still we know her name, Enheduanna, the first author, the first human voice that refused to disappear. There is a whole way of understanding this entire civilization hidden in that single fact. Everything the plain built out of mud, the cities, the temples, the towers, the empires, is gone or in ruins. The great walls fell. The gods are no longer worshipped. The kings who built pyramids of skulls and carved themselves as divine are names in a museum. But the marks, the small pressed wedges in the humblest material there was, the river's own mud, the marks survived. Not the palace, the clay tablet, not the crown, the signature. It is one of the deepest ironies of the plain, and one of its quietest lessons, that the most fragile seeming thing it made, a scratch in wet earth, turned out to be the most permanent thing of all. The hand fails. The mark outlasts the hand. Enheduanna, according to her own poems, was eventually restored. The goddess heard, or the politics turned, and she returned to her temple and her office. And she went on writing, and her work became a kind of scripture for the scribes who came after, taught and copied and revered, until she herself faded into legend and then out of memory entirely for thousands of years, until modern archaeologists digging in the ruins pieced her name and her poems back together out of the shattered tablets and gave her back to the world. She belongs to a truth about this civilization that is easy to miss under all the kings and wars, that women were woven all through it, not only as wives and mothers arranged in marriages, but as priestesses of enormous authority, as owners of property and runners of businesses, as brewers and weavers and lenders of silver, as managers of great temple estates, and, in Enheduanna, as the founder of authorship itself. The plain was a hard and hierarchical world, and much of its power ran through men. But the first person in history to stand up out of the anonymous crowd and say, "I wrote this," was a woman, and it is right that we say her name. Now the wheel turns again. Akkad has fallen, its capital erased. The mountain tribes have come and gone, and out of the wreckage the ancient south will rise one last time in its own name, in a final brilliant flowering of Sumerian civilization, a renaissance of law and building and bureaucracy so complete that it left behind more written records than almost any age before the modern world. Before it too falls, in one of the most heartbreaking catastrophes the plain ever recorded, and is mourned in a poem that still aches across the centuries. After Akkad fell and the mountain people were at last driven out, the Old South gathered itself for one final blaze of its own ancient glory. And it began, fittingly, not with a conqueror, but with a builder. A man remembered less for anything he destroyed than for what he raised. His name was Gudea, and he ruled the city of Lagash, and he is one of the gentlest figures in the whole long line of Mesopotamian rulers. He did not try to subdue the world. He turned inward, to his city, to its gods, to the making of beautiful things. His inscriptions tell of dreams in which the gods came to him and instructed him, in careful detail, to build them a temple, and he set about it, importing cedar from distant mountains and dark, hard stone from across the gulf, raising a sanctuary he believed the gods themselves had designed. We know his face because he had himself carved again and again in that dark imported stone called diorite. Dozens of small, dense, beautiful statues, and in nearly all of them he's not triumphing over anyone. He's sitting quietly or standing, hands clasped in front of him, head slightly bowed, a plan of the temple sometimes resting on his knees, his eyes calm. It is the image of a ruler who wanted to be remembered not as a killer of enemies, but as a servant of the gods and a maker of holy things. In a history so full of boasting warriors, Gudea's quiet folded hands are a kind of relief. But the true rebirth of the south came at Ur, where a king named Ur-Nammu founded a new dynasty, the one historians call the third dynasty of Ur, and reunited the plain, not with Sargon's raw ferocity, but with a more careful balance of central power and old tradition. And Ur-Nammu gave the world one of its greatest gifts, so quietly that it is often overlooked. He gave it written law. His law code is among the very oldest that survive, older than the famous one of Hammurabi by 3 centuries. And what is striking about it, reading it now, is how humane it often is. Where later codes would demand an eye for an eye, Ur-Nammu's laws frequently ask instead for payment. A man who injures another pays in silver. A wrong is set right not by matching wound for wound, but by restoring the balance. In its opening lines, the code declares that the king was chosen by the gods to establish justice in the land, to see that the orphan was not handed over to the rich, that the widow was not handed over to the powerful, that the man with 1 sheep was not handed over to the man with 100. 4,000 years ago, at the very dawn of written law, someone thought to write down that the strong should not simply be allowed to devour the weak. That idea, fragile, endlessly betrayed, never fully realized, is one of the oldest and best things the plain ever set down in clay. Ur-Nammu also built upward in the oldest tradition of the land. He began, and his successors finished, the great ziggurat of Ur, the vast stepped tower whose lowest terraces still stand today, reconstructed rising out of the desert. 3 huge platforms of brick climbing toward a temple at the summit, broad staircases mounting the flanks so that the worshippers ascended step by deliberate step toward the house of the god at the top. To the people of Ur, it was not simply a building. It was a mountain made by human hands on a plain that had no mountains, a bridge between the flat earth and the high sky, a visible promise that the divine order rose up out of the mud and reached toward heaven. Ur-Nammu was followed by his son Shulgi, who reigned for nearly half a century and turned his father's kingdom into one of the most tightly organized states the ancient world would ever see. Shulgi was an administrator of genius. He standardized the weights and the measures, so that a unit of grain in one city meant the same as a unit of grain in another. He reformed the calendar. He built roads and set up way stations along them, so that royal messengers could carry the king's commands swiftly across the whole realm. He reorganized the taxes so that grain and goods flowed steadily into the storehouses of the king and the temples. He expanded the scribal schools because a state run on records needs an endless supply of people who can keep them. And keep them they did. The 3rd dynasty of Ur left behind such a mountain of clay tablets, tens of thousands of them, receipts and ration lists and labour assignments and temple inventories, that we can reconstruct the daily workings of its economy in a detail we cannot match for almost any other ancient society. It was a civilization that wrote down nearly everything, a bureaucracy of breathtaking reach, in which workers were assigned to fields and workshops and building projects and counted and recorded as they went. And Shulgi, like Naram-Sin before him, reached past the ordinary limits of a king and declared himself a god, worshipped in temples across his own empire while still alive, praised in hymns not only as a ruler, but as a runner of superhuman speed, a scholar, a musician, a divine shepherd of his people. The line between the man and the god blurred again, as it kept blurring on the plain, wherever a ruler grew powerful enough to imagine that the distance between himself and heaven had closed. But the tightly wound state carried the seeds of its own undoing, and they were seeds sown, in the end, by the very soil it depended on. For there is a slow poison in irrigated farming on a hot flat plain, and the plain had been drinking it for 1,000 years. When you water fields again and again with river water, and the fierce sun draws that water up and evaporates it away, the salt the water carried is left behind, and it builds, season by season, invisibly, in the earth. Over centuries the ground grows saltier, and the wheat that will not tolerate salt fails, and the people shift to hardier barley, and then even the barley begins to struggle, and the great yields shrink. The records of these years show it happening, the harvest falling, the grain growing scarce and dear. The land that had fed the first cities was slowly salting itself to death beneath the feet of the people who worked it. It is one of the earliest lessons the plain has to teach, and one of the most urgent for our own time, that a way of living can quietly ruin the very ground it stands on, and that the ruin can be so slow no single generation quite sees it happening. And so, weakened from within by the failing soil and the strain of its own vast administration, the 3rd dynasty of Ur was struck from without. New peoples pressed in, herders from the western deserts, and more dangerously the Elamites from the mountains to the east. The provinces broke away, and around 4,000 years ago the Elamites fell on Ur itself, stormed it, sacked it, burned it, and carried its last king away into captivity. The great ziggurat stood desecrated. The proud capital of the Sumerian Renaissance was a ruin, And here the plain gives us something almost unbearably human. It gives us the grief. For the scribes of the shattered city sat down and wrote a lament, a long formal poem of mourning for the fall of Ur, and it survives, and it is one of the oldest cries of pure sorrow in all of literature. It mourns the temple standing empty, the streets where the dead lay unburied, the river that carried bodies where it had once carried boats. It imagines the city's own goddess weeping over her ruined home, begging the great gods to relent, pleading that her city be spared, and being refused because the decree had gone out and could not be recalled. The poem does not flinch. It sets down the horror and the loss in full, and it does something we recognise across 4,000 years. It tries to make the unbearable bearable by giving it words, by turning a catastrophe that has no meaning into a poem that at least has shape. We will meet that same impulse again, the same shape of a poem written to mourn a fallen city, much later on the plain, when other conquerors sack other capitals, and other scribes and other prophets sit down in the ashes and write their grief. It is one of the oldest human responses to ruin, and Ur is where we first hear it clearly. The city falls, and someone survives to write down what it was, so that the falling itself will not be lost. Step back from the kings for a while and look at the ordinary artery that kept the whole plain alive, the flow of goods and silver and debt, the first real economy the world had known, with all its ingenuity and all its cruelty. The plain, remember, was a land of almost nothing. It had endless mud and endless reeds, and when the water was managed, endless grain, and almost none of the other things a rich civilization craves. No metal in the ground, no good stone, no tall timber. Everything hard and precious and permanent had to come from somewhere else. And so, out of sheer necessity, the people of the rivers became traders on a scale no one before them had attempted. They sent their grain and their oil, and above all, their fine woolen textiles, woven by the thousand in the great temple and palace workshops, largely by women, out along the rivers and across the deserts, and in return they drew the world toward them. Copper from the mountains across the gulf, tin to harden it into bronze, silver from the north, timber from the western ranges, and the deep blue lapis lazuli that came all the way from Afghanistan, passed hand to hand across 1,000 miles of mountain and plain to end up set in a Sumerian queen's headdress. The graves and temples of the plain are full of materials that grew nowhere near it, hard physical proof of a web of exchange that reached from the mouth of the Indus to the shores of the Mediterranean. To make all that trade work, they needed a way to measure value, and they found one. Silver, weighed out on a scale. Not coins. Coined money was still more than 1,000 years in the future, but pieces of silver, cut and balanced against standard weights. A weight of silver could buy a measure of barley, or the rent of a field, or a length of cloth, and against silver almost anything could be priced. And once you can price things against a common standard, you can do the thing that transforms an economy and shadows it forever. You can lend, you can owe, you can put a number on a promise. Debt runs all through the records of the plain. A farmer borrows silver in the spring to rent an ox or buy seed, and promises to repay after the harvest. A merchant borrows to finance a caravan, pledging a share of the profit. Contracts were written down in careful detail on clay, the amount, the interest, the date it fell due, the names of the witnesses, because in a city of strangers, a promise had to be made into something that could be proved. And the interest could be brutal. A bad harvest, a failed venture, a flood at the wrong moment, and a family could find itself unable to repay. And then the debt came for everything. First the land, then the livestock, and then, in the harshest turn of all, the people themselves. A man who could not pay might be forced to hand over his children, or his wife, or finally himself, into bondage to work off what he owed. The same silver that oiled the trade of the plain could grind a free family down into debt slavery in the space of a single ruined season. The economy was vibrant and it was merciless, and the two things were not separate. They were the same machine, seen from above and from below. But here the plain did something that deserves to be remembered, because it is one of the more surprising and humane ideas in the whole ancient record. The kings understood that a society can strangle itself on its own debts, that if too many families are crushed into bondage, the fields go unworked, the soldiers go unfed, and the whole kingdom weakens. And so, from time to time, a new king, or a king in a moment of crisis, would proclaim what the Mesopotamians called, in a lovely phrase, a clean slate. He would cancel the debts, wipe them out. The word they used meant something like freedom, or restoration to the original state, and it meant in practice that the debt tablets were smashed, the bondsmen released and sent home, the forfeited land returned, the whole crushing accumulation of obligations simply erased, and everyone allowed to begin again. It was not pure mercy, and it would be sentimental to pretend it was. It was also cold good sense, a way of releasing the pressure before it blew the society apart, of keeping the farmers on the land and the soldiers loyal and the kingdom whole. But whatever the motive, feel what it meant to the family who had lost everything. A proclamation goes out from the palace, and suddenly the debt that was going to swallow your children is gone. The tablet recording it broken to pieces, your land yours again, your family free. In a world with no other safety net, the clean slate was the safety net. A periodic, deliberate forgiveness, built into the machinery of the state. A recognition that debt, left to run forever, becomes a form of quiet violence, and that a society sometimes has to reach in and cancel it to survive. That idea too did not die with the plain. The practice of periodic debt release, of a jubilee in which obligations are wiped clean and bondsmen freed and land restored, would echo forward into the lore of later peoples who lived along these same rivers in exile, and into their scriptures, and from there into the moral imagination of half the world. When people today speak of forgiving debts, of a jubilee, of wiping the slate clean and starting again, they are speaking, whether they know it or not, in a voice that first spoke on the Mesopotamian plain, from a palace looking out over farmers who could not pay. The economy the plain built left 100 other marks we still carry without noticing. The division of labour, the idea that one person grows food so another can make pots, so another can keep accounts, each depending on all. The written contract, binding strangers to their promises, the charging of interest on a loan, the management of surplus by great institutions. The very word we use for organised settled life, civilization, comes from the Latin for city, and the city was, first and above all, an economic engine, a place where surplus was turned into specialists and specialists, into things no village could make. In the crowded markets of Uruk and Ur, under the eye of temple and palace, human beings discovered that wealth was not only grain and cattle, it was trust and obligation and credit and debt, invisible bonds reaching across a city and across the world, holding strangers together in a web of mutual owing. It was a new way for people to be connected, and a new way for them to be trapped, and we live inside its descendants still. Every time we sign a contract or carry a coin or owe a debt, we mean to pay when the harvest, whatever our harvest is, at last comes in. And it was into this world of silver and debt and crushing obligation that there came a king who decided to write it all down, who took the sprawling, half-remembered customs of the plain, the rules of trade and marriage and injury and debt, and had them carved into a great black stone, and set that stone up in public where anyone could see it, and declared, "Here is the justice of the land, fixed, permanent, and known to all. His name was Hammurabi, and his city was Babylon. Babylon, when it first appears in the record, is nobody. A modest town on the middle Euphrates, overshadowed by cities far older and grander and more sacred, by Ur, by Nippur, by Uruk. Its walls held an ordinary place. Its temple was humble beside the soaring ziggurats of the south. If you had stood on the plain 4,000 years ago and been told that this unremarkable town would one day give its name to an age, to a byword for splendour and for pride that would still be spoken 5,000 years later, you would not have believed it. Babylon rose because it was ruled at the right moment by the right kind of ruler, patient, cunning, and long-lived. His people were Amorites, one of those herding peoples from the western deserts whom the old settled cities had long regarded with suspicion, and who had filtered in as the older order weakened and made themselves at home and in time made themselves kings. And the greatest of them came to Babylon's throne around 38 centuries ago. His name was Hammurabi. He did not inherit an empire. He inherited a small, exposed kingdom hemmed in on every side by rivals as strong as himself. Powerful cities to the south, to the east, to the west, and a rising power to the north. For most of his long reign he was patient. He strengthened his walls, deepened his canals, kept his gods well served and his farmers loyal, and cultivated the image of a just and careful ruler, a shepherd of his people. And he waited, and he watched his rivals, and he chose his moments. And then, in the last decades of his reign, he struck, playing his enemies against one another, breaking them one at a time, absorbing city after city, until the small exposed kingdom of his youth had become the master of nearly the whole plain. And Babylon, the town that had been nobody, was the capital of an empire and the acknowledged centre of the Mesopotamian world. But Hammurabi's conquests are not why we remember him. Empires rose and fell on the plain like the seasons. His own barely outlived him. We remember him for a stone. Near the end of his reign, he had his laws collected and carved onto a great pillar of black stone, more than 2 meters tall, and set up in public where the people could see it. Nearly 300 provisions cut into the rock in careful columns. And at the top of the pillar, above the words, a carved scene. Hammurabi standing before the seated sun god, the god of justice, receiving from him the rod and the ring that were the symbols of authority. The message of that image is the whole theory of the thing in a single picture. Justice comes from the gods, but it is handed to the king and administered through him. The law is divine, and it is also now public, permanent, and the same for everyone who stands before it. Not hidden in a palace archive, not held in the changeable memory of a judge, cut into stone, in the open, where any man could come and see the rule that would be applied to him. What the stone actually says is a portrait of a whole society, clause by clause. It covers the buying and selling of fields, the terms of trade, the wages of labourers, the fees of doctors, the responsibilities of builders. It covers marriage and divorce and inheritance, the protection of a wife's dowry, the rights of children. It covers theft and assault, and the settling of debts, and the treatment of slaves. Farmers and merchants and artisans and priests and soldiers and nobles and slaves all move through its clauses, each bound by particular duties, each granted or denied particular protections. To read it is to walk through the streets of Babylon and see how the whole machine was meant to run. It is famous, of course, for one principle above all, an eye for an eye. If a man destroys the eye of another, they shall destroy his eye. If he breaks another's bone, they shall break his bone. This idea of exact retaliation, that a harm should be answered by an equal harm, no more and no less, sits at the code's dark heart, and it has echoed down the ages, harsh and memorable. But to leave it there is to miss half of what the stone says. because the same code that demands an eye for an eye also reaches out, again and again, to protect the ones most likely to be crushed. It shields the widow and the orphan. It protects a tenant farmer who cannot pay his rent because a flood or a storm destroyed his crop. In a bad year, the code says, he owes nothing. It guards a wife's property so that her husband's family cannot simply seize it if he dies. It recognizes that life on the plain was fragile, that disaster was never far, and that a law worth the name has to hold some ground for the powerless against the powerful. And yet, and this is the honest part, the part it would be false to soften, the justice of Hammurabi's stone was not blind. It saw very clearly who stood before it. The punishments were not the same for everyone. They depended on rank. If a noble injured another noble, the answer was equal retaliation, eye for eye. But if a noble injured a commoner, he could pay a fine and be done. And if a noble injured a slave, the penalty was lighter still. The same wound was worth more or less depending entirely on whose body carried it. This was a law that assumed and enforced a rigid ladder of human worth, nobles above commoners above slaves, and made no pretense otherwise. It is one of the sharpest reminders the plain can give us that the ancient world was not our world, that its ideas of fairness ran alongside a hierarchy we would find monstrous, and that we should neither excuse it nor pretend it away. But here is why the stone still matters, in spite of all of that. It is not the fairness of the individual laws that made it a landmark. Some are humane, some are savage, some are strange. It is the fact of the thing itself. By carving the law into stone and standing it up in public, Hammurabi declared something the world had barely begun to grasp, that justice was not the whim of whoever happened to be in power that day, but a set of fixed and knowable rules, written down, the same tomorrow as today, binding, at least in principle, even on the king who proclaimed them, because he too received them from the god and stood beneath the god's justice. In a world where power was usually just power, raw and arbitrary, that was a genuinely revolutionary claim. The law could be known, the law could be public, the law could stand above the moment. However imperfectly the plain lived up to it, and it lived up to it very imperfectly. The idea had been set in stone, and it would not go away. That idea travelled far. The peoples who later lived along these same rivers, and were carried into exile beside them, absorbed something of this tradition of written, public, divinely sanctioned law, and it passed into their own scriptures, the protections for the widow and the orphan, the settling of injuries, the very notion of a covenant of law between a people and their God, and from there it flowed into the moral and legal imagination of much of the world. Every constitution written since, every book of statutes, every published law that a citizen has the right to read and hold the powerful to, carries a faint, distant impression of that black stone standing in the sun in Babylon, with a god handing down the rod and the ring, and a king declaring that from now on the rule would be known to all. Hammurabi died, and within a couple of generations his empire came apart, and Babylon was taken by others and would rise and fall many more times across the centuries. But the town that had been nobody had become an idea that would never quite die, a name for greatness and for law, and eventually, when it grew proud enough, for the pride that goes before a fall. We are not done with Babylon. It will rise again, more dazzling than ever, under a king whose name the whole world would come to know. But first we must turn to the deepest question of all, the one that lay underneath the kings and the laws and the trade. The question of what all of this was for, and what the people of the plain believed about the gods who ruled them, and about the death that waited in the end for every king and every slave alike. Underneath everything, the canals and the codes, the silver and the kings, the people of the plain were trying to answer the questions that no storehouse and no army could touch. Why does the river flood one year and fail the next? Why do the innocent suffer? What happens when we die? And in their answers, told and retold and finally written down, they built one of the richest imaginative worlds the human mind has ever produced. A heaven crowded with gods as vivid and quarrelsome and dangerous as the people who worshipped them. Their gods were everywhere and in everything. The wind that flattened the barley, the fresh water that welled up in the marsh, the sun that crossed the sky, the moon that measured the months. Each was a god, with a name and a temper and a story. At the summit sat the Sky Father. Below him, the Lord of the Wind, who decreed the fates and carried the storms. There was the god of the sweet underground waters and of wisdom, the clever one, the friend of humankind, forever inventing and rescuing. There was the sun, who was also the god of justice, whose light reached everywhere and saw everything and so was fit to judge. And there was Inanna, later called Ishtar, the goddess of love and of war both at once, of desire and of slaughter, the most alive and least predictable figure in the whole heaven, who could bless a marriage in the morning and level a city in the afternoon, and in whom the plain seems to have put everything it found most beautiful and most terrifying about being alive. These were not distant, serene, perfected beings. They were enormous, and they were near. They loved and quarrelled and schemed and took revenge. They could be flattered and offended, pleased and neglected, and crucially, in the myths the plain told about the beginning of things, the world itself was not born in peace. It was born in conflict, out of the mingling of the primordial waters, and it came to its final order only when a champion god rose and slew a monster of chaos, and split the monster's body to make the sky, and the earth, from her eyes, some said, flowed the two rivers themselves. The universe, in this vision, was not a safe and settled place. It was order wrestled out of chaos and held in place by divine will, always precarious, always one failure of the gods away from sliding back into the dark. Which is exactly how the plain felt to live in, fertile and deadly, generous and treacherous, a thin skin of green held against the flood and the desert, by ceaseless labour and ceaseless prayer. And why were human beings made in these stories? Not for glory, not because we were loved. We were made, the myths say, to work, fashioned out of clay, mixed with the blood of a slain god, and set to labour so that the gods themselves would not have to. Our purpose was to feed them, to serve them, to dig their canals and grow their grain and keep their temples, to bear the burden the gods had grown tired of bearing. It is a bleak and clear-eyed origin story, and it fit the life it came from, a life of endless toil under powers vastly greater than yourself, on whose moods your survival hung. Every meal set before a god statue, every festival, every offering was understood as the repayment of that original debt, the debt of existence itself, owed by the servant to the master who had made him to serve. And when that life of labour ended, here the plain offered no comfort. There was no bright paradise waiting, no reward for the good, no reunion in the light. There was only the underworld, a dim, dusty land beneath the earth, the same for everyone, king and slave alike, where the dead lived on as thin shadows of themselves, eating clay and drinking dirty water, stripped of joy and vitality, sitting in the gloom. The only thing that eased their existence was the offerings the living made to them, the food and drink poured out by their descendants, which was why families kept small altars and remembered their dead, and fed them across the boundary of the grave. To be forgotten, to have no one left to pour the offering, was to be truly abandoned, to thirst forever in the shadows. The living and the dead were bound together by obligation, generation to generation, in a chain of memory and libation that could not be allowed to break. Now hold all of that in your mind, the gods who made us to labour, the underworld waiting dim and inescapable at the end. and you will understand why the greatest story the plain ever told is the story it is. Because the plain took a real king, a ruler of Uruk named Gilgamesh, who may truly have walked the earth in the deep past, and over long centuries it grew around his name the epic that stands, still, as one of the oldest and greatest works of literature in the world, the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the epic is about the one thing no king, however mighty, could command, and no god would grant to a human being. It is about death, and the refusal to accept it. Gilgamesh begins the story as a king too strong and too restless, grinding his own people down, until the gods sent him a wild man, Enkidu, raised among the animals, to be his match and his check. And the two of them fight and cannot beat each other, and become, instead of enemies, the closest of friends, bound together in a love that is the beating heart of the whole poem. Together they go adventuring, kill a monster, defy the gods, and then the gods, offended, strike Enkidu down. He sickens, and he dies slowly in front of Gilgamesh, and Gilgamesh watches his friend, the one person who matched him, the one he loved, become a corpse, and then watches the corpse begin to change, until at last he understands what has happened, that this is real, that Enkidu is not coming back, and it breaks him. Not with grief only, but with terror, because if Enkidu can die, so can he. The great king, who feared nothing, is suddenly and completely afraid of the one thing he cannot fight, and he sets out half mad across the edges of the world, past monsters, across the waters of death, to find the one man who is said to have escaped dying, to learn the secret of eternal life and wrest it back for himself. It is the oldest quest in literature, and it is the most human. A person who has looked for the first time straight into the fact of their own death and cannot bear it, and goes to the ends of the earth to undo it, and he fails. That is the greatness of the poem and its unflinching honesty. He finds the man who escaped death and hears the story of a great flood, a flood sent to wipe out humankind, and a single family saved in a great boat, riding out the water until it came to rest on a mountain, and a bird was sent out to find dry land. A flood story so close to one that would be told much later by another people along these rivers that the resemblance stunned the modern scholars who first read it. But the secret of eternal life in the end slips through Gilgamesh's fingers. A plant that might have restored his youth is stolen by a snake while he sleeps. There is no escape, even for him, even for the strongest king who ever lived. He must die, as everyone must. And so he comes home to Uruk, to the city he had left, and the poem ends. This is the last, quiet, extraordinary turn, with Gilgamesh standing on the walls of his own city and looking at them, the great walls of Uruk which he had built, because that, the poem says, is the only immortality a human being will ever have. Not to live forever, no one lives forever, but to make something that outlasts you. The wall, the city, the work of your hands, standing after the hands are gone. A king who could not accept death is brought at the very end to the only comfort there is, that though he must die, the marks he leaves need not die with him. It is, when you sit with it, an almost unbearably fitting story for this civilization to have produced, the civilization whose whole quiet miracle was exactly this, that its marks outlasted its hands, that its clay survived its kings. Gilgamesh went looking for the wrong immortality, and came home to the right one, and 4,000 years later, we're still reading the poem that told him so. The story about the failure to escape death is the very thing that made its author, and its king, and its whole vanished world in the only way that was ever possible undying. For centuries after Hammurabi, the plain shifted and settled and shifted again. Babylon endured, battered by one people after another. And far to the north, along the upper Tigris, in harder and more exposed country, a city was slowly gathering a strength unlike anything the plain had seen. Its name was Asher, and the people who took their name from it, the Assyrians, would become the most feared power the ancient Near East had yet produced, a state that made war not an interruption of ordinary life but the very centre and purpose of it. They didn't begin as warriors. They began, of all things, as merchants. Long before Assyrian armies marched anywhere, Assyrian traders were sending donkey caravans far to the west into the highlands of Anatolia, carrying tin and fine textiles, setting up trading colonies, dealing in silver, keeping careful accounts on clay of every partnership and every risk. They were organised, connected and prosperous. But wealth on the plain always drew the eye of the hungry, and the north was harder country than the south, edged by mountains, exposed to raiders, without the flat protective sameness of the southern marshes. To survive, there was to be always ready to fight, and over long centuries that constant pressure hardened the Assyrians into something singular, a people whose very identity came to rest on military strength, whose kings called themselves shepherds but were armed shepherds, always watching for the wolf, always striking first. Their god helped make them what they became. Where the southern cities each had a patron god among many equals, the Assyrians worshipped their god Asher in a way that fused religion and conquest into a single thing. Asher was not merely the god of a city, he was the state itself, made divine. To expand Assyria was to expand the domain of Asher. To conquer was to do the god's will. And the kings framed their endless campaigns not as ambition, but as holy duty, war carried out for the glory of the god who had chosen them. It gave them a justification for conquest that never ran out, because there was always more world that did not yet belong to Asher. And the machine they built to take that world was terrifying, and in cold truth, brilliant. Where older armies had been farmers called up in the season of danger and sent home to their fields, the Assyrians built one of the first true standing armies, professional soldiers, kept year-round, drilled and equipped and ready. They mastered iron, which took and held an edge that bronze could not match, and armed their troops with it. They developed cavalry and chariots, and above all the terrible art of the siege, the battering rams that swung against city gates, the towers rolled up to the walls, the engineers who tunnelled beneath the foundations to bring them down. City after city, wall after wall fell to them, and they made a deliberate policy of horror. This is the hardest part of the Assyrian story to tell, and there is no honest way around it. Their kings boasted in their own inscriptions of atrocities, of enemies flayed, of cities burned, of captives impaled in rows before the walls of the next city they meant to take, and the boasting was the point. This was not madness or mere cruelty for its own sake. It was strategy, coldly conceived. Terror was a weapon aimed at the future, designed so that the next city, hearing what had happened to the last, would open its gates without a fight, its will to resist broken before the army even arrived. They carved these scenes onto the walls of their palaces, endless friezes of conquest. Archers, siege engines, kings riding over the fallen, long lines of captives led away in chains, and they displayed them where every visitor and every envoy would have to walk past them, so that the message of Assyrian invincibility was pressed into the mind of everyone who came before the throne. Their art was, to a degree the world had not seen before, propaganda, a deliberate manufacturing of dread. But terror alone does not hold an empire together, and the Assyrians knew it. They built one of the most sophisticated systems of rule the ancient world had produced. Conquered lands were turned into provinces under governors the king appointed and watched. A network of roads and relay stations let royal orders travel across vast distances at a speed that must have seemed almost magical. the king's word reaching a distant province in days, and they used deportation as a tool of control on a massive scale, uprooting whole rebellious populations and resettling them far away in other corners of the empire, breaking their local roots and their capacity to rebel while spreading their skills and their labour where the empire wanted them. It was brutal, and it was effective, and it reshaped the human map of the whole region, mixing peoples together in ways that would echo for a very long time. At its height, in the 7th century before our era, the Assyrian Empire stretched from Egypt to the mountains of Iran, from Anatolia to the Gulf, by every measure the greatest power the Near East had yet seen, ruled from magnificent capitals whose palaces were guarded by colossal winged bulls with human faces, carved from stone, standing at the gates to overawe all who entered. And here the story of the terror state takes a turn that no one would predict, and it is one of the great ironies of the plain. Because the last of the great Assyrian kings, Ashurbanipal, a conqueror like his fathers, was also something almost none of them had been: a reader. He boasted, and it seems to have been true, that he could read the old and difficult languages himself, Sumerian and Akkadian, without a scribe to help him, and that he understood the hardest texts. And he used the reach and the wealth of his terrible empire to do something magnificent. He sent his agents out across the land to gather up the writing of the whole civilization, its myths, its hymns, its omens, its medical texts, its histories, its lore, and he assembled it at his capital Nineveh into a great library, tens of thousands of tablets, copied and organized and stored. Think of what that means. The most feared war machine of the ancient world became, in its last king, the great preserver of the written heritage of Mesopotamia. And when Nineveh fell, as it did spectacularly, when a coalition of the peoples Assyria had ground down for so long, finally rose together, marched on the capital and burned it so completely and so quickly that the collapse of the empire astonished the entire ancient world. When the great city burned, the fire did a strange and merciful thing. It baked Ashurbanipal's clay tablets hard. Buried in the ash and rubble of the destroyed palace, hardened by the very flames that ended the empire, the library survived. It lay in the earth for 2,500 years. And when modern archaeologists dug into the mounds of Nineveh, they found it. And out of it came the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Flood story, and a huge share of everything we know about the mind of the ancient plain. The empire that ruled by terror is gone, remembered as a byword for cruelty. But the words it saved endured. The king who could read, born into a dynasty of conquerors, reached across the centuries and handed us the voice of a whole civilization. The hand fails, the mark outlasts the hand, and sometimes it is the cruelest of hands that, almost in spite of itself, saves the marks. Nineveh fell in fire, and in the fire the words were made permanent. When Nineveh burned and the Assyrian terror finally guttered out, the power that had crushed nations for centuries vanished with shocking speed, and into the space it left, an old city stepped back into the light. Babylon, which had been great under Hammurabi, and then endured 1,000 years of foreign masters, rose one last time, and this time it rose to a splendour that would fix its name in human memory forever. The dynasty that raised it is called Neo-Babylonian, the New Babylon, and its greatest king reigned for more than 40 years, from just after 600 before our era, Nebuchadnezzar II. To his own people he was the restorer of Babylon's ancient glory, the king who made the city the wonder of the world. To others, to the peoples his armies broke, his name became a byword for destruction and exile. He was both of those things at once, as the great kings of the plain so often were, and the two cannot be separated. His armies reached out across the whole Near East. He defeated the Egyptians and took control of the lands along the eastern Mediterranean. He demanded tribute from the wealthy Phoenician cities of the coast, and most famously, most fatefully, he turned against the small kingdom of Judah and its capital Jerusalem. When Jerusalem defied him, he besieged it, took it, and carried off its king and thousands of its leading people to Babylon. And when it rebelled again a decade later, he came back with overwhelming force, and this time he did not forgive. He tore down the walls of Jerusalem and he burned its great temple, the Temple of Solomon, to the ground, and he carried away its treasures, and he marched much of its population into captivity along the canals of Babylon. That deportation, the Babylonian exile, was one of the most consequential events in the whole religious history of the world, though Nebuchadnezzar could not possibly have known it. For the exiled people, sitting by the waters of Babylon and weeping for the city they had lost, did not dissolve into the empire as so many deported peoples had before them. They held together, they wrote, they gathered and shaped their traditions and their scriptures in exile, and wrestled with the meaning of their catastrophe. And out of that long grief in a foreign land came much of what would become the Hebrew Bible, and with it, in time, the roots of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is one of the strangest turns in this whole story, that a king of Babylon, by breaking a small kingdom and dragging its people to his capital, helped set in motion a religious tradition that would outlast Babylon by thousands of years and reach far more of the human race than his empire ever did. In the scriptures that came out of that exile, Babylon became the eternal symbol of proud, glittering, doomed, worldly power, and that image of Babylon the Great and Babylon the Fallen would echo through Western imagination for the next 2,500 years. But to the man himself, these were acts of necessity and of destiny, and the wealth they brought flowed back into Babylon and became beauty. Nebuchadnezzar poured the plunder and the tribute of his conquests into rebuilding his capital into the most dazzling city on earth. He raised its walls so broad, the later Greeks marvelled, that chariots could be driven along the top of them. He rebuilt the great temple of the city's god, Marduk, and he built, above all, the Ishtar Gate, a ceremonial gateway into the sacred heart of the city, faced entirely in glazed brick of a deep luminous blue, and set across that blue, in moulded relief, rows of golden lions and bulls and strange horned dragons, the sacred animals of the gods, marching in procession. Through this gate ran the great processional way, walled on both sides with more blue brick and more striding lions, along which, on the high festival days, the statue of Marduk was carried in glory. To come to Babylon and pass under that blazing blue gate, past the golden beasts into the city of the god, must have been one of the great sights of the ancient world, a wall of jewelled colour rising out of the brown plain, unlike anything else that existed. When you see fragments of that gate in a museum today, reassembled, the blue still shocks. Thousands of years, and it still looks like it was fired yesterday. And it is here, in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, that we meet one of the most famous stories of the ancient world, and one of its deepest mysteries, the hanging gardens of Babylon, the terraced cascading gardens, green and impossible, watered by some ingenious hidden machinery, which later writers named among the 7 wonders of the world, and said Nebuchadnezzar had built to comfort his queen, who came from a green and mountainous land and pined, on the flat brown plain, for the hills of home. It is one of the most beloved images the ancient world has left us. A king building a mountain of gardens out of love to ease his wife's homesickness. And here is the mystery, the kind of honest puzzle that makes the past feel alive rather than settled. For all of Babylon's own vast records, and Nebuchadnezzar was a prolific builder who boasted in inscription after inscription about everything he raised, Not one Babylonian text has ever been found that mentions these gardens. The Babylonians described their walls and their gate and their temple in loving detail. About the most famous garden in history from Babylon itself there is silence. The gardens appear only in the accounts of much later Greek writers, describing a city most of them had never seen. So did they exist at all? Some scholars think the story is a later invention or exaggeration. But one modern scholar has made a fascinating case for a different answer, that the gardens were real, but that they were never in Babylon, that the classical writers, working from confused sources, put them in the wrong city, that the great terraced watered gardens actually stood far to the north, at Nineveh, built not by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, but by an Assyrian king a century earlier, the very Assyrians whose reputation for engineering and for waterworks was unmatched. On this reading, the most famous wonder of Babylon may not have been in Babylon at all, and history has spent 2,000 years admiring the right marvel in the wrong place. We may never know for certain, and there is something wonderful in that even about one of the most famous things in the ancient world, the past keeps a little of its mystery and refuses to give us the tidy certainty we crave. Whatever the truth of the gardens, the glory of Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was real, and it was brief. After his long reign, the throne passed through weaker hands, a son remembered as feeble, a grandson murdered as a boy, a series of short and troubled reigns, until at last the crown came to a strange and fateful king named Nabonidus. And Nabonidus did something that would help bring the whole shining edifice down. Where every Babylonian king was expected to honour Marduk above all, the great god of the city, Nabonidus turned instead to the moon god, raising his worship, restoring his temples, and, most damaging of all, leaving Babylon for years at a time to live far away in a desert oasis in Arabia, while his son governed in his absence. To the powerful priesthood of Marduk, and to many of the people, this neglect of their great god was close to blasphemy, and it opened a crack in the loyalty that held Babylon together. And beyond the eastern horizon, a new kind of power was rising, patient, tolerant, and utterly unlike anything the plain had faced before, watching that crack and waiting. The power rising in the east came from the Iranian plateau, and it was led by one of the most remarkable rulers the ancient world would ever produce, a man the future would call Cyrus the Great. He began small, a king of a minor Persian territory, under the overlordship of a larger neighbour. But through a combination of daring, war, and something rarer, a genius for winning peoples over rather than merely crushing them, he overthrew his overlords, united the Persian tribes, and then expanded outward at breathtaking speed. He conquered the wealthy kingdom of Lydia in the west, with its legendarily rich king. He swept across vast territories, and everywhere he went he did something that set him utterly apart from the Assyrians who had terrorized these same lands not long before. Where they had ruled by flaying and deporting and shattering, Cyrus ruled by respect. He left conquered peoples their gods, their customs, their local ways. He presented himself not as a destroyer but as a liberator, a restorer of right order. And so, again and again, cities that might have resisted him to the death instead opened their gates, because his rule looked less like conquest than like relief. By the year 539 before our era, he turned toward Babylon, and Babylon on the surface should have been unconquerable. Its walls were legendary, thick and high and long. Its wealth was immense, its prestige was ancient, but inside it was divided and weak. The priesthood of Marduk alienated by Nabonidus's neglect of their god, the people burdened and discontented, the loyalty that binds a city to its king worn dangerously thin. Cyrus didn't see only a fortress. He saw a fortress with the door already unlocked from within. His army met the Babylonian forces in the field and crushed them, and then Babylon, the great city of Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar, the city of the Blue Gate and the towering ziggurat, the city whose name meant power itself, fell, and it fell almost without a fight. The old accounts tell it in ways that shimmer between history and legend. Some say Cyrus's engineers diverted the Euphrates, which ran through the heart of the city, lowering the water until his soldiers could march in along the riverbed, under the great walls, on a night when the Babylonians were said to be feasting unaware. Others say the gates were simply opened from within, by people who had had enough of Nabonidus, and welcomed the Persian as a deliverer. However it truly happened, the result was the same, and it was astonishing in its bloodlessness. The mightiest city in the world changed hands, and there was no sack, no burning, no slaughter, no toppling of temples. Cyrus walked into Babylon as a king, not as a butcher, and what he did next tells you why he is remembered as he is. He did not desecrate Marduk's temple, he honoured it. He had it proclaimed that Marduk himself had chosen him, had grown angry with the faithless Nabonidus, and reached out to Cyrus to set the city right, casting the Persian conqueror not as a foreign invader, but as the god's own agent, come to restore proper worship and just order to Babylon. On a clay cylinder, buried in the city's foundations in the old Mesopotamian way, Cyrus set down his version of events, that he had entered the city in peace, that he honoured its gods, that he had ended the mistreatment of its people, and that he was allowing the displaced peoples of the empire to return to their homelands and rebuild their temples. That cylinder survives, and it has been called, with some exaggeration, but not entirely without reason, one of the earliest charters of tolerant kingship in the world. The Babylonian priesthood welcomed him. The weary people accepted him. Babylon had fallen, and yet Babylon had not been destroyed. And among all the displaced peoples Cyrus allowed to go home were the exiles of Judah, the very people Nebuchadnezzar had dragged from their ruined Jerusalem and settled by the canals of Babylon. Cyrus let them return, and he permitted them to rebuild their temple and to restore the traditions that the Babylonian conqueror had tried to end. To that people, this foreign Persian king was nothing less than deliverance itself, and in their scriptures he is remembered extraordinarily as an instrument chosen by their own God, a Gentile ruler named and blessed, the anointed one who sent the exiles home. There is hardly a stranger tribute in all of history. A conquered people, generations later, still honouring the foreign emperor who let them go free. But for the plain itself, for Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers, the fall of Babylon in 539 was something more final than the fall of one more dynasty. It was the end of an age that had lasted 3,000 years. For 3 millennia since the first cities rose out of the southern mud, this land had been the maker of its own destiny. Sumer, Akkad, Babylon, Assyria. Each had risen and fallen, but always within the frame of Mesopotamian civilization, ruled from Mesopotamian cities by Mesopotamian kings, in the old languages, under the old gods. Now that frame itself was gone, Mesopotamia became a province, a rich and honoured province, but a province, of an empire whose heart lay elsewhere, on the Iranian plateau, an empire that would soon stretch from the edge of India to the shores of the Aegean, the largest the world had ever seen. The centre of gravity had moved. Babylon remained a jewel, but it was no longer the beating heart of anything. Decisions that shaped nations were no longer made on the plain. The rivers still ran, still flooded, still fed the fields, but their political course had been joined forever to a wider ocean. The old distinct Mesopotamian world did not vanish overnight. Under the Persians, Babylon's temples were kept, its scribes employed, its canals maintained. Priests still tended Marduk, the festivals still filled the streets, markets still thrived, and, in the tablet houses, a dwindling number of scholars still pressed wedges into clay, still copied the ancient texts, still charted the stars from the old platforms. But the unique rhythm of Mesopotamian independence, that long drumbeat of rival cities and homegrown empires rising and falling under their own gods, that rhythm had been broken, and it would never be restored. What came next would be layer after layer of foreign rule, each leaving its mark, each pressing the old world a little deeper beneath the new. The Persians first, then a young conqueror from the west, who would die in Babylon itself, in Nebuchadnezzar's own palace, before he was 33. Then Greeks, and Parthians, and Persians again, and at last a new faith out of the southern deserts that would raise, on these same rivers, one final city of wonders. The plain was not finished, but from now on, its story would be written by others. 200 years the Persians held the plain, and Babylon lived on as a province of magnificence, no longer sovereign, but still ancient, still awesome, still drawing rulers to be crowned in the shadow of its ziggurat. And then, in the year 331 before our era, the old order shattered on a battlefield in the dust of northern Mesopotamia. There, on a wide plain, a young king from Macedonia named Alexander faced the last great Persian emperor and destroyed his army. And when Alexander marched south to Babylon, the city, as it had for Cyrus, opened its gates. There was no siege, no sack. The priests came out to meet him in procession. The people acclaimed him, and Alexander, who understood the power of old symbols, entered as a king who wished to belong to the city's story, sacrificing to Marduk, honouring the ancient rites, ordering the restoration of the great ziggurat that stood, half ruined, at the city's heart. To rule Mesopotamia, he grasped, one had to step into the line of kings stretching back through Nebuchadnezzar and Hammurabi and Sargon, to become part of a story far older than Greece. And Alexander saw in Babylon something more than a prize. He seems to have imagined it as the capital of his whole vast new world, a place where East and West might meet, a city older and grander than anything in his homeland, sitting at the crossroads of everything he had conquered. He made plans to restore its temples, to deepen its harbours, to make it once again the beating centre of civilization. For a moment, at the very end of the ancient plains' independence, it looked as though Babylon might be reborn as the heart of the largest empire the world had ever known. And then, in that same city, in 323 before our era, Alexander fell ill after a banquet, and within days he was dead, at 32. The conqueror who had crossed continents died in Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon, his grand plans for the city dying with him. His empire, held together only by his own impossible will, tore itself apart among his generals almost before his body was cold, and Babylon's last chance to be a capital again died on that bed. In the long struggle that followed, Mesopotamia fell to one of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, who founded a dynasty of his own, Greek kings ruling the old plain, and they made a decision that quietly sealed Babylon's fate. Rather than rule from the ancient city, weighed down as it was with its priesthoods and its immovable traditions, Seleucus built a brand new capital nearby on the Tigris, a Greek city with a grid of straight streets and a theatre and a gymnasium, laid out fresh, a clean page on which a new culture could be written without the dead weight of the old. And slowly, over the following century, the life of Babylon drained away toward that new city. Its people moved, its markets emptied. The ancient capital, which had survived Assyrians and Persians and welcomed Alexander, began its long, quiet dying, not by conquest, but by being simply left behind. Yet even now the old plain did not fall silent all at once. The Greek kings, foreign as they were, still respected the prestige of Babylon's temples. The priests still performed their rites. The scribes still copied their tablets. Something remarkable happened in this twilight. The astronomy of the plain, with its centuries of patient records of the movements of the planets and the stars, flowed into the science of the Greeks, and the two traditions met and enriched each other. The very framework of the zodiac, the division of the sky that astrologers and astronomers still use, took much of its shape in this meeting of Babylonian skywatching and Greek thought. In temples, the old gods were quietly matched with Greek ones, Marduk with Zeus, Ishtar with Aphrodite, the sun god with Apollo, and in the streets of the new cities you might hear a hymn to Marduk on one corner and a discussion of Greek philosophy on the next. The plain had become a crossroads of a wider world, no longer the source of civilization but a contributor to it, its ancient wisdom flowing outward into the great mixing bowl of the age. Then the Greeks gave way to new masters. The Parthians, horsemen from the Iranian plateau, heirs to the traditions of the steppe and masters of the bow, pushed in from the east and took Mesopotamia, and the balance tilted once more away from the Greek west and back toward the Iranian east. Under the Parthians, the plain became the great contested frontier between the two superpowers of that age, the Parthian Empire and Rome. And on that frontier in 53 before our era, the Parthians dealt Rome one of the worst defeats in its history, when a Roman commander led his legions deep into the Mesopotamian plain expecting an easy victory, and instead met the Parthian horse archers, who circled his stranded soldiers and poured arrows into them from a distance the Romans could not answer, until the legions were annihilated and their commander killed. For centuries after, the wars of Rome and Parthia, and then of Rome and the Persians who followed, surged back and forth across the Mesopotamian plain. The same old contested heartland, now fought over by empires whose homelands lay far away, the farmers rebuilding their trampled fields between the armies as they always had. The Parthians gave way in turn to a new Persian dynasty, the Sasanians, who revived the old Iranian religion and ruled with a stronger, more centralized hand, and who made Mesopotamia one of the core provinces of their empire. On the Tigris, across from the old Greek capital, they raised a magnificent city of their own, and there they built a palace crowned with an arch, a single enormous vault of brick, the largest of its kind in the ancient world, so daring and so vast that it still stands today, broken but unbowed, a lonely sentinel of pale brick rising out of the plain, one of the last great monuments the old land would raise before a new age swept over it. And somewhere in all of this, quietly, without any ceremony, unnoticed by almost anyone alive at the time, the oldest thread of all came to its end. For 3,000 years, scribes on the plain had pressed wedges into clay. Cuneiform had recorded the accounts of Uruk and the laws of Hammurabi and the library of Ashurbanipal and the observations of the astronomers. But the world had changed around it. Simpler scripts, alphabets you could learn in weeks instead of years, had spread and become the writing of daily life and trade and administration. Cuneiform retreated into the temples, kept alive by a shrinking handful of learned families who used it now only for the old religion and the old astronomy, copying and recopying a tradition that fewer and fewer people could read. And then, sometime around the 1st century of our era, the last scribe who knew the old signs pressed the last wedge into the last tablet and set down the reed, and cuneiform, the first writing in the history of the world, the script in which civilization itself had learned to remember, went silent. No one recorded the moment. No one marked it. The knowledge simply thinned and faded and was gone, and the little pressed wedges that had carried 3,000 years of human thought became, to everyone who came after, meaningless marks in the dirt, a dead language in a forgotten script waiting in the ground. It would wait almost 2,000 years, and when at last in the modern age scholars cracked it open again and learned to read those wedges once more, the voice of the whole ancient plain came flooding back out of the silence. Gilgamesh and Enheduanna and Hammurabi and the lament for Ur, all of it, speaking again after 2 millennia in the dark. But that resurrection is the very end of our story, and it is still ahead of us. For now the plain fell quiet under its foreign masters, its old gods fading, its old script dying, its old cities crumbling into mounds, waiting, though it did not know it, for one last age of astonishing brilliance, and for a new city on the same old rivers that would light up the whole world. By the 7th century of our era, the plain was exhausted. The 2 great empires that had fought over it for so long, the Persians of the Sasanian dynasty and the Romans of the East, the Byzantines, had bled each other nearly white in a final ruinous war, campaigns that had trampled Mesopotamia's fields and sacked its cities and drained both powers to the bone. And it was into that exhausted, war-weary world that a new force came, out of the deserts of Arabia, carrying a new faith and a unity no one had seen coming. The armies inspired by the message of Islam struck the frontiers of the Sasanian Empire and found not an impregnable wall, but a hollow shell, worn out and disillusioned, its people tired of endless war and misgovernment. In a great battle the Persian army broke. The road to the Sasanian capital lay open, and when the Arab forces entered that city of palaces on the Tigris, they found its treasures abandoned and its great arch standing over a fallen empire. Within a few short years, the plain that had birthed the first cities on earth belonged to the expanding world of Islam. The new rulers did not come to erase, they came to inherit. They found a land rich in agriculture and scholarship and old urban life, and they built upon it, keeping the canals, keeping the fields, adopting and adapting the administration left behind by Persians and Romans. The Arabic language spread slowly, becoming in time the tongue of religion and rule. The faith spread slowly too over generations, alongside older communities of Jews and Christians and Zoroastrians who long remained. And then, a little more than a century after the conquest, a new dynasty, the Abbasids, took control of the Islamic world and made a decision that would return the plain, one final time, to the very centre of human civilization. In the year 762, their caliph founded a new city on the banks of the Tigris. He called it, among other names, the City of Peace. We know it as Baghdad. And it was built not as a mere provincial capital, but as a deliberate seat of empire laid out as a perfect circle, a great round city, its massive walls enclosing a ring nearly 2 kilometres across, with the caliph's palace and the great mosque at the very centre, and the streets radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel toward gates that opened toward all the provinces of the realm. The symbolism was total, the world ordered around the caliph, every road leading to the centre, the city itself a map of a well-ordered universe. And it grew with astonishing speed. Within a generation, Baghdad was the largest city in the world, a place where merchants converged from China and India and Africa and Europe, where the markets overflowed with silk and spices and gold and ivory, where a dozen languages could be heard in a single street, and boats crowded the Tigris, and the whole restless wealth of a hemisphere flowed through the bazaars. But Baghdad's true glory was not its wealth, it was its mind. The Abbasid caliphs became patrons of learning on a scale the world had never seen, and they did something wise and generous. They gathered scholars of every background, Muslims and Christians and Jews, Persians and Greeks and Indians, and set them to work together. at the great centre of learning that later ages remembered as the House of Wisdom. The philosophical and scientific texts of the Greeks were translated into Arabic and saved. The mathematics and astronomy of India were studied and absorbed, and the old traditions of the plain itself, the astronomy first charted from Mesopotamian temple platforms 3,000 years before, were carried forward. It was in Baghdad that a scholar working through these traditions developed the discipline we still call algebra, a word that comes straight from the Arabic. His own name, worn down through Latin translation, gave us the word algorithm. Astronomers built observatories and inherited the star-watching of their Mesopotamian ancestors. Physicians compiled great encyclopedias of medicine, preserving and advancing the knowledge of the ancient world. In the libraries and lecture halls of Baghdad, the accumulated learning of Greece and India and Persia and old Mesopotamia was gathered, translated, argued over, and built upon, and much of it would flow, centuries later, into a reawakening Europe, which received a great part of its own classical inheritance back through the hands of the scholars of Baghdad. And it was not only for the learned. The culture of the City of Peace ran through ordinary life, poets reciting in the courtyards, storytellers weaving the tales that would one day be gathered into the great collection the world knows as the 1001 Nights, musicians blending Arab and Persian and Greek traditions, calligraphers turning the written word itself into an art so beautiful it needed no other subject. To live in Baghdad at its height was to live at the centre of the world, in a place where knowledge and trade and faith met in an abundance that dazzled every visitor who came to it. On the same rivers that had carried the silt that built the first cities, humanity had raised, one more time, a wonder. And here we can see the deepest continuity of the whole long story. The plain had done this before: Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, and now Baghdad. Again and again, whenever the rivers of grain and trade and knowledge and faith converged in one place, the land between the two rivers threw up a great city that became, for an age, the heart of the human world. The gods had changed, the language had changed, the script had changed, the faith had changed. But the pattern held. The plain kept doing the thing it had always done. It kept building the centre, but greatness on the plain had always been fragile, and Baghdad was no exception. Over the centuries, the Abbasid caliphs lost their grip on their vast empire. Provinces broke away, generals seized real power, and the caliph in Baghdad became more and more a figure of spiritual prestige than of true rule. The city remained a jewel of learning and commerce, its libraries full, its scholars active, but it was no longer the master of its world. And then, in the year 1258, catastrophe came, in a form more total than anything the plain had suffered in all its long history of conquerors. The Mongols came. They came out of the east in overwhelming force, and Baghdad, weakened and divided, could not stand against them. The city fell after a short siege, and what followed was one of the great destructions in the history of civilization. The Mongols sacked the City of Peace with a thoroughness that stunned the world. The people were slaughtered in numbers the chroniclers could barely bring themselves to record, and the libraries, the accumulated books of the greatest centre of learning of its age, were destroyed, thrown into the Tigris, so many of them, the old accounts say, that the river ran black with the ink of the drowned books, and red with the blood of the drowned scholars, and a man could have crossed the water on the raft of floating volumes. It is almost too heavy an image to bear. The ink and the blood in the river together, the words and the people destroyed in the same water. The City of Peace, the wonder of the world, lay in ruins. Baghdad would revive in time and endure, and remain a great city into our own age. But it never again held the centrality it had known under the early Abbasids. The heart of the world moved elsewhere, to Cairo, to Istanbul, to the rising cities of the west, and Mesopotamia became once again what it had so often been, a rich and storied province, contested by empires, living in the long shadow of its own astonishing past. The coming of Islam and the raising of Baghdad had been the last great blaze of the plain's ancient gift, proof that even after 4,000 years of rise and ruin, the land between the rivers could still, one final time, light up the whole world. And when that blaze was drowned in the Tigris, the long, long story of Mesopotamia as a maker of civilizations came, at last, to its close. But it did not truly end. Nothing that is written ever fully ends, and what the plain had given the world across those 4,000 years was about to reveal itself as more permanent than any empire, more enduring than any city, woven so deeply into the fabric of human life that we carry it, unknowing, every single day. We have spent so long among kings and gods and empires that it's easy to forget who actually lived on the plain. Not the god-kings on their monuments, not the conquerors washing their weapons in distant seas. Ordinary people, the tens of thousands and then the millions of them, born and living and dying between the two rivers across 4,000 years, whose names are almost all lost, but whose lives, thanks to the marks they left in clay, we can partly reach. Let us leave the thrones for a while, and walk instead through an ordinary day on the plain, in an ordinary city, in the ancient world. It begins before the light. In the flat land there is no mountain to hide the dawn, and the sky pales all at once from edge to edge, enormous over the low rooftops. A family wakes in a house of mud brick, cool from the night, its small rooms opening onto a central courtyard where the cooking fire is banked. The house is plain and sturdy and close-packed against its neighbours, sharing walls, so that the whole neighbourhood is a single warren of thick brown walls and narrow lanes and flat roofs where, on the hottest nights, people sleep out under the stars. There is no glass in the small high windows, only the light and the air. The floor is packed earth, swept smooth, and beneath some of these floors, in the old way that never entirely died, lie the family's own dead, kept close, remembered. The first work of the day is bread and beer, and both come from the same grain, and both are made mostly by women. Barley is ground on a saddle-shaped stone, the grinder kneeling and pushing a smaller stone back and forth, a labour so constant and so hard that it wore grooves into the bones of the women who did it, and left grit in the flour that wore down the teeth of everyone who ate the bread. The flour becomes flat loaves baked against the hot wall of a clay oven, and barley becomes beer, thick, nourishing, drunk through a reed straw to strain the husks, safer than the water of the canals, a food as much as a drink poured for gods and workers alike. The smell of baking bread and the low smoke of the cooking fires rise up over the whole waking city. Out beyond the walls the farmer goes to the fields in the grey light, and his day is the oldest work there is. He walks along the raised banks of the canals, those canals that his grandfather and his grandfather's grandfather helped to dig, that must be cleared of silt every year or the water will not come. He watches the level of the water with the anxious attention of a man whose children's winter depends on it. If it is the season, he follows the plough, a wooden plough with a clever funnel built into it, so that seed drops straight into the furrow as the oxen drag it open, an invention of the plain. He mends a break in a dike. He drives off the birds. His body bends to it year after year, and the bending shows in his bones. He is not free quite. He likely owes rent and labour to a temple or a great household, a portion of his harvest promised before it is even grown. But the land is old and rich beneath the salt, and in a good year, with the flood behaving and the god content, there is enough, and more than enough, and that surplus is the reason the whole shining city up the road exists at all. In the city, the scribe goes to work in a different way. Perhaps he trained for years in the tablet house, a hard school remembered in its own texts with a kind of rueful humour. The long days, the strict masters, the endless copying of sign lists, the beatings for a careless line. Now he sits with a fresh tablet of damp clay and a cut reed, and into that soft grey surface he presses the wedges that make him, in this world of the unlettered, a small kind of power. He records a sale of a field, with the boundaries and the price and the names of the witnesses. He writes out a marriage contract or a loan or a receipt for grain delivered to the temple. He drafts a letter for a merchant to be carried to a partner in a far city, sealed so no one can alter it. His clay dries and hardens, and it will outlast him by 4,000 years, and some of the letters he wrote, complaints, apologies, demands for payment, notes between brothers, a scolding from a mother to a son who has not written, survive, and they are so ordinary, so exactly like the messages people send each other now, that reading them collapses the 4,000 years to nothing. A man writes to complain that the copper he was sold was of poor quality, and that he has been treated with contempt. A schoolboy's exercise records his excuses for being late. The plane gives us back not only its kings, but its irritations, its small human daily friction, unchanged. In the great workshops the weavers work, many of them women, some of them owned, some of them free and paid in rations of grain and oil and wool, sitting at their looms turning the fleece of the temple's vast flocks into the woolen cloth that was the plain's treasure and its export, the thing it traded to the whole world for the metal and stone and timber it lacked. In other quarters the potters turn their wheels, and the smiths beat copper and bronze, and the jewellers set the blue stone from far away, and the carvers cut their tiny perfect scenes into stone seals. Each of them lives a life given to a single craft, fed by the farmer's surplus, a specialist in a world that specialization had only recently made possible, and the children. The children carry water and tend the goats, and learn the work of their parents by doing it. A lucky few, mostly boys, mostly of families with means, go to the tablet house to become scribes and hate it and remember it. The rest learn the field and the loom and the oven and the herd. They play. Games and toys turn up in the digs, little clay carts and rattles and dice and figures. They fall ill more than we would like to think in the crowded city, and too many of them die young and are buried under the floor, close, remembered. And the ones who live grow up into farmers and weavers and scribes and mothers and soldiers, and do the work and have their own children, and are buried in their turn generation after generation, the whole vast anonymous river of ordinary human life flowing on beneath the monuments, unrecorded and yet, through the marks in the clay, not entirely lost. Evening comes to the plain the way morning did all at once, the huge sky reddening from edge to edge, and then going violet and then dark. The workshops fall quiet. The farmer comes back along the canal bank in the cooling air. The family gathers in the courtyard around the low fire, and there is bread and beer, and the day's talk, and perhaps a story of the gods, of the fierce goddess and the clever water god, of the great flood, of the king who went to the ends of the earth to escape death and failed and came home. The lamps are small clay dishes of oil with a floating wick, and they throw a low warm light on the mud walls. Overhead the stars come out in their thousands over the flat land. The same stars the priests are watching from the temple platform, reading them for the will of heaven, writing down their movements in the patient records that will one day become the root of astronomy itself. And the family, under those stars, on the ground their ancestors made out of river mud, lies down to sleep above the bones of the dead in the oldest cities in the world, and the night closes over the plain, and the two rivers run on in the dark toward the sea, carrying the mountains south, grain by grain, as they have always done, and as they will do long after the sleepers and their city and their gods are gone. This was the life underneath the history. This was who was actually there. And when we ask what the plain left behind, the truest answer is not the ziggurats or the empires. It is these lives, and the astonishing fact that so many of them still whisper to us out of the clay across 4,000 years of silence. So the cities fell, and the empires fell, and the language died, and the script went silent, and the plain sank back into being a province of other people's worlds. By every ordinary measure, Mesopotamia ended. And yet, this is the strange and beautiful truth at the close of the whole story. Almost nothing that mattered about it was actually lost. It had simply migrated. It had passed out of the dying cities and into the bloodstream of civilization itself, where it still runs, in us tonight, mostly unnoticed, mostly unnamed. Begin with the most obvious thing, the thing you're doing this very moment, reading, writing. Every alphabet in the Western world, and many beyond it, can be traced back along a chain of borrowings and simplifications to the ancient Near East, to the moment when human beings first grasped that a mark could stand for a sound. The cuneiform of Uruk is not the direct ancestor of our letters. The line runs through other scripts, but the idea, the founding idea that speech could be frozen into visible marks and read back later by a stranger, was born on that plain, in that storehouse, from that need to count what the mind could no longer hold. Everything written since, every book, every law, every letter, every scripture, every word on every screen, is the descendant of that first decision to press a thought into clay. We are all, in the deeper sense, still writing on the plain, then the city itself. The idea that human beings could live not in bands or villages, but in their thousands and tens of thousands, packed together, strangers among strangers, bound by shared rules and shared work rather than by blood. That idea was invented at Uruk, and it never went away. Every city on earth, from the greatest capital to the smallest town, is a distant child of that first experiment on the southern mud, the discovery that a crowd of strangers could become a community, and that the surplus of the fields could be turned into the specialists and the wonders that only a city can make. And with the city came all its machinery, and we have kept nearly all of it. The written law, public and fixed and knowable, standing above the whim of the powerful, first cut into Hammurabi's stone. The bureaucracy that counts and records and administers, first built in the temples and the great palaces of the plain. The organized state that manages shared resources and calls up labor and settles disputes, grown, we saw, out of the need to move water fairly through the canals. Money and interest and debt and the written contract, first weighed out in silver on the plain's own scales. The idea of empire, of many peoples under one rule, first dreamed at Akkad and never abandoned since. So much of the invisible architecture of organized human life, the structures we move through so constantly that we no longer see them, was first raised between the two rivers. Some of the plain's gifts hide in places so ordinary you would never guess their age. Look at a clock, 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. Look at a circle, 360 degrees. Why 60? Why 360? Because the mathematicians of the plain, for reasons of their own, built their number system not on 10, as we mostly do, but on 60, a wonderfully flexible base, divisible cleanly by 2 and 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and more, easy to split and share. And their base 60 counting flowed down through the astronomers and the geometers of the ancient world and lodged itself permanently in the way we measure time and angle. Every time you glance at the hour, every time you speak of a 90-degree turn or a full 360, you're using, without knowing it, the arithmetic of the Sumerian scribes 4,000 years after they set it down. Their fingers still move the hands of your clock, and they gave us the sky. Watching the heavens night after night from their temple platforms, keeping patient records across centuries of the wandering of the planets and the turning of the stars, the astronomers of the plain laid the foundations on which Greek and then all later astronomy would build. The constellations of the zodiac, the very habit of dividing the sky into signs and reading meaning in the movements of the planets, carry the imprint of Mesopotamian sky watching. When you know your star sign, you are echoing, however distantly, the priests of Babylon reading the will of heaven in the lights above the flat black plain. They were more than sky watchers, though. The scholars of the plain were the first great scientists of the human record, in the sense that they were the first to gather observations patiently, over generations, and write them down, and look for the hidden order beneath the surface of things. Their mathematicians could work problems that would not look out of place in a classroom today. They understood, more than 1,000 years before the Greek who gets the credit, the relationship between the sides of a right-angled triangle. They calculated areas and volumes, solved for unknown quantities, and worked with a concept close to the square root, all pressed into clay in the wedge script, for the practical business of surveying fields and digging canals and raising walls, and then, increasingly, for the sheer pleasure of the problem itself. And they drew maps. Among the oldest maps in the world come from the plain, including a famous one that tried to picture the whole known world at once, the cities and the rivers and the encircling sea, with Babylon, of course, set proudly at the centre of everything. To make a map is to make a claim as bold as any conqueror's, that the mind can lift itself above the flat earth and hold the whole shape of the world in a single glance. The plain made that claim first. They studied the body too, and the healing of it. Their physicians compiled long catalogues of ailments and remedies, describing symptoms with careful attention, and prescribing treatments drawn from plants and minerals and animal substances. A vast accumulated pharmacy, mixed, it is true, with prayer and ritual against the demons they believed brought disease, but grounded also in real observation, in the patient noticing of what helped and what did not, passed down and written down and built upon. And alongside the healers stood the diviners, reading the future in the liver of a sacrificed sheep, in the shapes of oil poured on water, in the flight of birds and the movements of the planets. For the plain believed, more than almost any culture before or since, that the universe was legible, that it was constantly signalling its intentions to those who knew how to read the signs, and that a patient enough scholar could learn its language. It was not our science, but it was the same deep impulse that drives ours, the refusal to accept that the world is simply chaos, the conviction that beneath the confusion there is an order, and that a human mind, patient and humble and armed with written records, can begin to read it, and that impulse, more than any single discovery, is the true root of everything that would one day grow into astronomy and mathematics and medicine and the whole vast project of understanding the world. Long before there was a word for science, the scholars of the plain were quietly practicing its oldest article of faith, that the universe rewards attention, that patient looking and careful writing down will, in time, give up the hidden pattern of things. We are still, 4,000 years later, keeping that same faith and building on the records they were the first to keep. And all of this, the mathematics and the medicine, the star charts and the maps, the myths and the hymns and the laws, was held together and passed down by an institution the plain also invented, and that we have kept in 1,000 forms, the school. In the tablet houses, generation after generation of children bent over their clay, copying the sign lists, learning the old words, memorizing the literature, complaining bitterly about their masters in exercises that survived to make us smile. It was hard and narrow and open to only a few. But it was the first place in the world dedicated to the deliberate passing of accumulated knowledge from one generation to the next. The first classroom, the ancestor of every school and library and university that has ever stood. The plain understood 4,000 years ago, the thing on which every civilization since has depended, that what one generation learns must be taught to the next, or it is lost, and that writing and teaching together are how a species climbs slowly out of the dark. And then there are the plain, hard, physical things, the ordinary tools we handle without a thought, most of which trace their beginnings to this same stretch of ground. The wheel, first turning as a potter's disc and then, fitted to an axle, rolling under the first carts and war wagons. The sail, catching the wind to carry boats up the rivers against the current. The seed plough that dropped grain into the furrow as it cut. The arch and the vault, the brick and the kiln, the woven sail and the twisted rope. The plain was a workshop as much as a temple, a place where practical human cleverness, freed by the surplus of the fields, invented and refined the everyday machinery of civilized life. So much of it that to list it fully would be to list half the contents of the world. We reach for these things 100 times a day and never once think of the flat land where a patient, anonymous someone first worked them out. But perhaps the deepest inheritance of all is the one that reaches into the spiritual life of half the world. We have followed, thread by thread, how the peoples who lived along these rivers and were carried into exile beside them absorbed the plain's oldest stories and ideas and wove them into their own. The great flood, with its single righteous survivor and his boat and the bird sent out to find dry land. Told on the plain 1,000 years before, it was told again in the scripture that would become the shared inheritance of Jews and Christians and Muslims. The garden at the beginning of things, the making of the first human from clay, the confusion of tongues at a great tower on the plain of Babylon, the very image of Babylon itself as the archetype of proud and doomed worldly power. All of these carry the deep memory of Mesopotamia. The debt release, the jubilee, the clean slate, the protection of the widow and the orphan written into divine law, the covenant of law between a people and their God. When more than half the human race today opens a scripture and reads of the flood, or the garden, or the tower, or Babylon the Great, they are reading, transformed and made new, the oldest imagination of the land between the rivers. The gods of the plain are not worshipped anymore, but the stories the plain first told are told in one form or another in nearly every house of worship on earth. This is what it means to say that the hand fails and the mark outlasts the hand, said now not of a single clay tablet but of a whole civilization. Mesopotamia, as a place with its own kings and its own gods, is gone, sunk under the dust, its cities reduced to low brown mounds on a hot plain. But Mesopotamia as an idea, as a set of inventions, as a way of organizing human life and imagining the cosmos, did not die at all. It won. It became the water we all swim in, so total and so ordinary that we forget it was ever invented, forget it had a birthplace, forget that once there was a world without cities and without writing and without law, and that the world with all of those things began on one particular difficult plain between two particular rivers, made by particular human hands that are 4,000 years in the dust. They wanted, from the tower at Jericho onward, to make something that would outlast them. They succeeded beyond anything they could have dreamed. They did not outlast their own deaths. No one does. But their marks outlasted them so completely that we live inside them and no longer even see the walls. And that, in the end, is the only immortality there has ever been, not to escape death. to leave a mark deep enough that the living, long after, are still shaped by a hand they will never see. For nearly 2,000 years the plain forgot itself. The cities became mounds. Wind and flood, and the slow work of the centuries wore the mud brick walls back down into the mud they had come from, until the great capitals, Ur, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, were nothing but long low hills of rubble and dust, rising a little above the flat land, scattered with broken potsherds, grazed by the flocks of people who had no idea what they walked upon. The names lingered, some of them, in scripture and in legend. Babylon, above all, remembered as a symbol of vanished pride, a byword rather than a place. But the reality was gone. Travellers crossing the plain saw only shapeless hills. The language was unreadable. The kings were forgotten. The first civilization on earth had sunk so completely out of memory that people doubted it had ever been more than a story. 4,000 years of human achievement lay silent under the feet of shepherds, waiting. And then, in the 19th century of our era, the plain began to speak again. It started with adventurers and diplomats and early archaeologists digging into those mysterious mounds and finding, to their astonishment, that the hills were not natural at all, that they were made of buried cities. Out of the earth came the colossal winged bulls of the Assyrian palaces, so huge they could barely be moved, and the carved stone friezes of kings and sieges and lion hunts, and, above all, the tablets, thousands upon thousands of clay tablets, covered in those strange wedge-shaped marks that no living person could read. The great library of Ashurbanipal, baked hard in the fire of Nineveh, came up out of the ground after 2,500 years, and no one knew what it said. The cracking of that code is one of the great intellectual adventures in human history, and it took the patient, obsessive work of many minds across many years. Scholars puzzled over the wedges, guessing, testing, failing, using the rare inscriptions written in more than one script, a known language beside the unknown one, as a key to pry the thing open. Slowly, sign by sign, sound by sound, the dead script yielded. The wedges became sounds, the sounds became words, the words became sentences, and the voice of the ancient plain, silent for 2 millennia, began to be heard again. And when it was heard, it delivered a shock that ran around the world. Because among the tablets from Nineveh, a scholar working through the broken fragments came upon a story of a great flood, sent to destroy humankind, and a man told to build a great boat and save his family and the animals, and the boat coming to rest on a mountain, and a bird sent out to find dry land. It was unmistakably a version of the flood, written down on the Mesopotamian plain more than 1,000 years before the scripture that had made it famous. When the scholar first read it, the account goes, he grew so excited that he began to undress in the room, oblivious to everything, overwhelmed by what he was seeing. And when the discovery was announced, it caused a sensation, because it meant that the oldest stories of the world's great religions had roots older still, down in the clay of a civilization no one had even known existed a generation before. Piece by piece, the whole lost world came back. Gilgamesh returned, the oldest epic, the king who could not accept death. Hammurabi's laws were read again. The lament for Ur was heard again. Enheduanna's name and her poems were pieced back together, and the first author in history, forgotten for 4,000 years, was given back her authorship. Kings whose names had not been spoken since their empires fell stood up again out of the dust. The plain that had forgotten itself was remembered, not by its own descendants, who had long lost the thread, but by the patient labour of scholars leaning over broken clay, reading the marks that had, exactly as their makers hoped, outlasted the hands that pressed them. But the plain is not only a place in the past, it is a living land, and it is inhabited now as it always has been, and its recent history has been as heavy as any age it endured. The rivers still run through it, the Tigris and the Euphrates, though dammed and diverted upstream now, running lower than they did. The country we call Iraq is laid across the old heartland of Mesopotamia, and its people live among the mounds of the oldest cities on earth. In our own time, that land has known terrible suffering, wars that have swept back and forth across the ancient plain, cities bombed, families torn apart, the same soil that fed the first civilization soaked again and again in blood. And in the chaos of those wars, the plain's deep past was wounded too. Museums were looted, and priceless things that had survived 4,000 years vanished into the black market in a single night. Ancient sites were dug into by thieves, or deliberately smashed by fanatics who filmed themselves destroying statues that had stood since the days of the Assyrian kings. It was heartbreaking, and it was a reminder that the marks the plain left us, permanent as they have proved, are not invulnerable, that they depend in the end on the living to protect them, and yet the land endures, and its people endure, and the memory endures. Scholars and archaeologists, many of them Iraqi, work to recover what was stolen, to protect what remains, to piece the broken things back together as their predecessors pieced together the shattered tablets. The great museums of the world hold the blue bricks of the Ishtar Gate and the carved bulls of Assyria, and the black stone of Hammurabi, and the golden treasures of Ur, where millions of people file past them every year and feel, however dimly, the pull of that first deep past. And the name of Babylon still means what it has meant for 3,000 years. Grandeur and pride and the fragility of even the mightiest works of human hands. The plain remembers itself now. It took 2,000 years of forgetting and a century of patient rediscovery, but the first civilization on earth is known again, read again, spoken of again. The hand failed and lay in the dust for 4,000 years, and the mark waited, and in the end, exactly as the tower builders of Jericho and the scribes of Guruk and the poet of Ur all seem to have hoped, without ever being able to know, the mark was found and read and outlasted the hand, outlasted it not by centuries but by the whole vast span from the beginning of writing to the age of the machines that carry these words to you now. The two rivers still run to the sea. They still carry the mountains south, grain by grain, the way they did before there were any cities at all, the way they will long after ours are gone. And on the ground those rivers made the oldest story of all, the story of how human beings first learned to stay and build and write and remember, lies open again at last, waiting for anyone who cares to read it. And now the long journey's nearly done, and there is nothing left to do but rest. So let the story settle over you like the fine grey silt settling on the plain after a flood, slowly, softly, layer upon quiet layer. There's nothing more you need to hold on to tonight. You can let the kings go. You can let the empires go. You can let the whole vast procession of names and cities loosen and drift away into the dark, the way they all, in the end, drifted away. Let your eyes close if they are not closed already. Let the weight of the day go out of your shoulders, out of your jaw, out of your hands. Let yourself grow heavy and warm and still, sinking gently into the quiet, the way the old cities sank gently into the earth, without struggle, without fear, simply coming to rest. Breathe, slowly. And as you breathe, let your mind go out one last time, softly, over that flat land under its enormous sky. The night is warm there. The two rivers move through the dark, unhurried, the way they have moved for 100,000 years, carrying the mountains south, grain by grain, patient and endless. On the plain the cities are sleeping, Uruk with its great walls, beneath its stepped tower, Babylon behind its blue gate. All of them quiet now, their lamps gone out, their people asleep on the rooftops under the same wheeling stars that turn above you tonight. Think, as you drift, of all the ones who slept on that plain before you. The farmer, home from the canals, lying down tired and content. The weaver, her hands still at last. The scribe, his tablets drying in the dark. The child, curled and dreaming above the bones of the ancestors, safe, held, home. 4,000 years of people lying down at the end of the day exactly as you are lying down now, letting the day go, letting the dark come, trusting the morning to arrive as it always had. You are the newest of them. You're lying down at the end of the same long human day, and the same stars are keeping watch. They were not so different from you, those sleepers on the plain. They loved and worried and hoped and grew tired and rested. They wanted the same simple things: enough food, a safe roof, the people they loved close by, a little peace at the end of the day. And they wanted, some of them, to leave one small mark that would say, I was here, I lived, remember me. And their marks outlasted them by 4,000 years and reached across all that darkness and found their way to you tonight, in the quiet, at the far end of the world they could not have imagined. That is the gift the plain leaves you with. Not the empires, not the wars. Just this, that a life, however small, however far away, can leave a mark that lasts, and that the marks of the ones who came before are all around you, holding you up, even when you cannot see them. So rest now. You have followed the whole long story, from the first seed to the last tablet, and you have arrived, safe, at the quiet end of it. There is nothing left to do. Let the rivers run on without you tonight. Let the cities sleep. Let the dust settle, soft and grey and warm over everything. The hand fails, the mark endures, and the great slow story goes on carrying us all south, grain by grain, toward whatever sea is waiting. And you are part of it now, one more life on the long shore, laying down your own small mark in your own brief day. And that is enough. That is more than enough. From all of us here at Ashes of Civilizations, thank you for spending this night among the ruins with us. The civilizations fall, the ashes remain, and out of the ashes always something new is built. That is the oldest story there is, and it is still being written in you tonight. Rest now, traveller. Let the plain keep watch. Let the rivers carry you gently down into sleep. Sleep well, and good night.